In this compilation episode, we will continue to look back at some of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries throughout the annals of history. Back in the 1800s, in the remotest regions of jungle and rainforest lay a predator so deadly that many tribes were afraid to speak of it. However, what a couple of explorers witnessed was beyond terrifying. Not only did they watch this thing consume a human being as a sacrifice, but the predator was not what they were expecting. Could it be possible that somewhere in the deepest recesses of some unknown jungle wilderness in the Congo, plants of sufficient size feast upon even larger prey, even human beings? Imagine saving up all of your money for that one trip you always have wanted to take. Maybe you live in the US and finally have a chance to visit Europe. Maybe vice versa. Maybe your tastes are far more exotic and you wish to see the natural wonders of our very world. The wild places which human beings have yet to tame, where adventure seems to lurk around every corner. Maybe you find yourself in an isolated jungle. You go deep into the forest, wondering with each step whether or not anybody else has ever set foot where you are at this instant. It's an exciting prospect, but inevitably, you will have to use the bathroom. You might have a tour guide and, seeking some privacy, step off the trail, still within earshot, but breaking the line of sight so you can do your business. You find a nice patch of clear ground amidst the vines and leaf litter as a good place as any, and you drop trow, settle in, and try to relax so you can get on with your tour. You're about halfway done when you notice something moving. It's curling up by your foot, long and serpentine. Your first instinct is to freeze. It looks like a snake has made its home here, and then you take a closer look and realize it's not that bad. No, it's much, much worse. Whatever this is, it's too long to be a snake. Now, still frozen, your eyes trace the length of this intruder, quickly finding the tail end before reversing in search of the head. You look and look, daring to turn your head ever so slowly, following the curves up to where they end. This is not a snake. It is a vine, and it is attached to a tree, and it is moving ever so slightly right there before your very eyes. And in moments, the vine whips around your ankle, tightening like a noose, and you're dragged pantsless off your feet and through the heavy cover of dead leaves. And before you know it, you feel the ground fall away behind you, leaving you suspended upside down in midair. You might cry for help, but you've wandered too far. It's too late. And before you, what you thought was once a tree trunk was now split down the middle, revealing a pink maw of jagged thorns as long as your forearm. The vine drags you ever closer, affording a glimpse inside your final resting place. Your last moments will be shared alongside the remains of other victims, the bones of monkeys, deer, even a human skull. The last thing you remember is being wrapped in the cold embrace of the tree trunk, the thorns piercing deep into you. The green of the jungle fades into darkness. You try to batter the interior walls of your newfound prison, but it is useless. You have just fallen victim to a man-eating plant. Sure, it sounds like utter science fiction, but there are some indications such a life form might actually exist on planet Earth. I mean, after all, we all are well acquainted with actual carnivorous plants, from Venus flycatchers to pitcher plants, which eat everything from insects to smaller vertebrates like amphibians. Man-eating plants have fascinated our imagination for over 100 years. These horrifying monstrosities have appeared in the pages of writers like H.G. Wells, have taken to the stage in the musical Little Shop of Horrors, and even graced our screens in the Harry Potter franchise. In Japan, there was once a belief in Juboko, or tree child, a type of yokai spirit that took the form of a tree on a battlefield, drawing strength from the blood that soaked into the earth. Having developed a taste for human fluids, it continued to sustain itself by using its limbs to snag any unsuspecting bystanders penetrating their flesh with a tube-like protrusion to drain their blood. Now afterwards, the juboko appeared like any other natural tree, although when it was cut, it leaked not sap but human blood. And the fact of the matter is, we are fascinated by the possibility of predation from the plant kingdom, a deep-seated fear which refuses to go away. Something about the very concept seems so very, very plausible. Now, in the Western scientific discourse, the origins of these fictional stories can be traced back well into the 19th century. Perhaps the most famous man-eating plant appeared in James Williams Buell's 1887 book titled Sea and Land, An Illustrated History of the Wonderful and Curious Things of Nature Existing Before and Since the Deluge. Sweet Christmas, that's a long title. Now, Buell's book, which is presented as a sober, rational work of nonfiction, has fueled more than a century of speculation. I mean, he mentions a species of plant known to grow throughout Central and South America, with related specimen found in Africa along the coastline of the Indian Ocean. Buell wrote this: "Travelers have told us of a plant which they assert grows in Central Africa and also in South America that is not contented with the myriad of large insects which it catches and consumes, but its voracity extends to making even humans its prey. It has a short, thick trunk, from the top of which radiate giant spines, narrow and flexible, but of extraordinary tenaciousness, and the edges of which are armed with barbs or dagger-like teeth. Instead of growing upright or at an inclined angle from the trunk, these spines lay their outer ends upon the ground, and so gracefully are they distributed that the trunk resembles an easy couch with green drapery around it. The unfortunate traveler, ignorant of the monstrous creation which lies in his way, and curious to examine the strange plant, or rest himself upon its inviting stalk, approaches without a suspicion of his certain doom. The moment his feet are set within the circle of the horrid spines, they rise up like gigantic serpents and entwine themselves about him until he is drawn upon the stump, when they speedily drive their daggers into his body, thus completing the massacre. The body is crushed until every drop of blood is squeezed out of it and becomes absorbed by the gore-loving plant, when the dry carcass is thrown out and the horrid trap is set again." Buell went on to claim that not only were these man-eating plants known to the indigenous populations, but that they had been witnessed by European explorers as well. And he tells the story of a gentleman whom he knew who lived in Central America for a number of years and had seen man-eating plants firsthand. According to this informant, the Central American man-eating plant does not leave its spines or vines limp, but instead sends them wildly flailing about in the air, like so many huge serpents in an angry discussion, occasionally darting from side to side, as if striking at an imaginary foe. Whenever its unwitting prey crosses into the path of one of these appendages, the victim is grasped in an unbreakable embrace. The limb closes around its new meal, embedding spines into the victim's body from all directions. Buell compared this method of constriction to the medieval torture device known as the Iron Maiden, a large coffin-like metal cabinet whose interior is lined with spikes. Now, Buell continued with a secondary story from another acquaintance, this time a learned scholar from Colombia, a Dr. Antonio Jose Marquez, a distinguished gentleman of the city of Barranquilla. In describing this wonderful plant to the author, affirms that when excited, it violently agitates its long tentacle-like stems, the edges of which, rasping around upon each other, produce a hissing noise which resembles the Spanish expression "ya te veo," the literal translation of which is "I see you." The plant is therefore known in South America by the name "ya te veo." He further asserts that so poisonous are the stems that if the flesh of any animal be punctured by the sharp barbs, a rapidly eating ulcer immediately forms, for which there is no known antidote, and death speedily ensues. Now, Buell closes the passage with a confession of skepticism, writing that, "I'm not inclined to doubt, not that there is no foundation for such statements as travelers sometimes make about this astonishing growth, but that the facts are greatly exaggerated." Buell's work suggests that the South American Yataveo may be the same, or at least related to, another carnivorous plant allegedly found in Africa. He alluded to one explorer who, while traveling the continent, watched a plant completely devour a native indigenous man. Buell claimed to have heard similar stories from the Fan or Fang people and modern Gabon, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea. According to Buell, these people supposedly executed criminals and those convicted of practicing witchcraft by throwing them into the arms of a massive carnivorous flora. Rumors of man-eating plants are most common in Madagascar. In fact, former Michigan Governor Chase Osborne highlighted the island's nation's terrifying folklore in his 1924 book, Madagascar, Land of the Man-Eating Tree. Talk about a horrible tourism campaign. Osborne's book republished a narrative from an old letter penned in 1874 by Karl Leich, a German traveler addressed to his Polish acquaintance, one Dr. Fidlowski. While Osborne's publication of the letter brought the story to a wider audience, it was by no means new. In fact, the correspondence had been reprinted shortly after Fidlowski received it in newspapers from all over the world, including the October 27, 1874 issue of the South Australian Register. It paints a grim picture not only of the terrifying flora found in Madagascar, but also of a culture of human sacrifice. According to the letter, Carl and another man by the name of Hendrik befriended a mysterious tribe of pygmies known as the Makotos. After earning their trust, the people eventually extended an invitation to the outsiders to attend said ritual. Now, Carl and Hendrik accepted and soon found themselves following the Makoto deep into the jungles. Eventually, they came to a bend in the stream, alongside which stretched a wide clearing. There, in the center, sat the dreaded plant. It was shaped like a pineapple, about 8 feet tall, and seemed to have bark as strong as the finest iron. Now, atop the tree grew 8 leaves, each about a dozen feet long. Carl and Hendrik cautiously examined the plant from a distance, noting unique details about these leaves. The inner side of each appendage seemed covered in spikes or spines like those of a cactus or a teasel. Each leaf terminated in a bowl-like depression atop the tree, which seemed filled with some sort of viscous fluid. From this bowl sprouted another set of fuzzy green tendrils, 7 feet long apiece, sticking out in all directions. These were in addition to a third set of growths, white or transparent, which waved in the air like ball of snakes. The ritual began. From the crowd, the Makotos snatched a young girl, dragging her closer to the tree. The entire crowd raised their voices in a chant as they forced her to climb the trunk towards certain doom. Half willing, half hesitant, she was urged into the bowl of thick fluid, where she took a long drink from the substance that lay pooled at her feet. Carl described what happened next. The slender, delicate palpi, with the fury of starved serpents, quivered a moment over her head. Then, as if instinct with demoniac intelligence, fastened upon her in sudden coils round and round her neck and arms. Then, with her awful screams and yet more awful laughter, rose wildly to be instantly strangled down again into a gurgling moan. The tendrils, one after another, like great green serpents with brutal energy and infernal rapidity, rose, retracted themselves, and wrapped her about in fold after fold, ever tightening with cruel swiftness and savage tenacity of anacondas fastening upon their prey. At this point, the leaves, stationary throughout the whole affair, began to twitch, rising up to seal the girl completely in her grisly tomb. All of the plant's appendages tightened, compressing the girl with sickening crunches. As it did so, her blood and bodily fluids began to seep between the leaves, mixing with the sticky sap to flow in reddish-brown streams down the trunk of the tree. The plant was satisfied. There was no immediate threat. Now the second half of the ritual began unfolding before Carl and Hendrik's horrified eyes. The Makoto people rushed towards the placated plant, gathering the fluid in cups in their hands or directly into their mouths. As they drank the mixture of blood and plant juice, the tribe became immediately intoxicated, leaving the scene to devolve into what Carl described as a grotesque and indescribably hideous orgy. Carl and Hendrik excused themselves, fleeing to the peaceful security of their tents. And over the coming days, they revisited the tree, noting how its appendages remained coiled around the girl for 10 days. After the 10th day, the Makoto tribe descended upon the ritual site once more, where the tree now sat open, ready for another victim. And there, at the foot of the tree, sat the girl's white skull, gleaming bright in the sunshine. Chase Osborne presented the letter with more than a hint of agnosticism, writing, "I do not know whether this tigerish tree really exists or whether the blood-curdling stories about it are pure myth and fiction. It is enough for my purpose if its story focuses your interest upon one of the least known spots of the world, Madagascar. If things in our garden can kill us, what about things in the air? And I'm not talking about birds either. What if I told you there have been reports of unidentifiable animals sighted and encountered by various eyewitnesses, not just around this particular mountain, but all over the country? Disturbingly, it's become such a widespread phenomenon that there are even books written on it due to the sheer volume of reports. What are they? Where did they come from? This eyewitness had the same questions as you when he first had his experience in the early 1990s. One night, in the early 1990s, an 18-year-old man, Brian Canfield, was busy traveling and driving in his pickup truck to Camp 1, which is a small community right near Lake Kapowsin in the Mount Rainier foothills. And it was roughly about 9:30 p.m. when suddenly, and without any warning, Brian's vehicle abruptly stopped in the road. Now, Brian was very puzzled by this because he had actually been accelerating just fine the entire time, and his car showed no signs of failure, yet the engine completely failed him, leaving him stranded in the middle of the road. Now, Brian would try several times to try and restart his truck, but nothing seemed to work, and so he's desperate, he's frustrated, and so he starts getting out of his truck into the small patch of road, and there's actually a bit of the road in front of him that's illuminated by his headlights. And so he's just sitting there trying to think of what to do. I mean, he's got to do something, but then something catches Brian's attention. A large figure that seems to be coasting down in front of him. And at first, he thought it was just an oversized bird, but he dismissed that possibility the moment it landed. Whatever it was heavy enough to send a large plume of dust flying into the air. Now, it took a moment for Brian to process what his eyes were showing him, but there in the middle of the road stood a 9-foot-tall beast, and it was covered head to toe in fur, which, oddly enough, took on this blue tint in his headlights, and it kind of made it shimmer, kind of like a peacock's feathers. And then this thing's fingers twitched and its wings began to unfold, and Brian then saw that its wings were as wide as the road, and then it turned its head, looked back at Brian, and then just started kind of flapping its wings, which, by the way, the air caused by the creature's takeoff was so strong that it actually shook Brian's pickup truck. And so the very last glimpse he got of this thing is that it was heading in the direction of Mount Rainier. Now, just a few minutes after this thing flew off, Brian's truck suddenly started. And so he gets back in and he takes off as fast as he could, eager to put distance between himself and whatever it was he had just encountered. Now, in fact, Brian was actually interviewed by journalist C.R. Roberts just days after the sighting, where he would tell Roberts what this thing looked like in detail. And he described as it stood up in front of his truck that it stood on a set of feet complete with long, sharp claws of a raptor, and then its eyes were yellow and shaped like a piece of pie with pupils like half a moon. And the mouth was pretty large, white teeth, no fangs, and the face was kind of like that of a wolf. And it was standing there just staring at Brian like it was resting, like it didn't know what to think. Now, Brian was obviously terrified, and it raised the hair all over his body, but he remains that he didn't feel threatened. He just felt out of place, as if this thing was looking right at him in a deep stare, as if it was looking through him, and it stood perfectly still, and it did this for several long minutes. Now, Brian would conclude in his interview that he would be willing to put his life on the line. This is how serious he was about telling the truth. Now, C.R. Roberts was very impressed by Brian during the interview. He thought he was a very genuine man. Roberts detected no signs of drug or alcohol abuse or any form of deception during the interview, and all of Brian's acquaintances had confirmed of his good character. Now, Sandra, which was Brian's mother, even told that her son was very visibly upset by what he had seen, and come to find out that later on, the trauma was so great for Brian that he confessed that he wished he had never seen this thing. And in fact, Brian's account was so sincere and genuine that it would go on to be featured in the April 24th, 1994 edition of Tacoma, Washington's News Tribune. Now, interestingly, later in 1994, Butch Whitaker, an amateur aviator and liquor store owner, swore that his airplane was actually paced in the sky in broad daylight by this enormous winged being. Now, it soared with him above Mount Rainier for a few moments before it would change its trajectory and would just fly off in the distance. And so Butch had no idea what to make of it, but this was far from over. Now, 4 years later, another witness claimed to have seen one of these things, which was struck by a logging truck on an isolated road. And the witness would watch as the vehicle hit an obstruction, initially thought to be a large log or a stump, and would send it off the shoulder of the road to pretty much dangle precariously over the mountainside. Now, eager to rescue the driver from what would surely be a fatal slide downhill, the witness rushed to help, only to see that the truck had not struck a stump at all. Whatever it was just massive and weird, and the rescuer wasn't sure what to make of it. And it was in that moment that the rescuer realized this wasn't a log or a stump, it was actually some sort of alien-looking animal. And as a matter of fact, when they would share the details about this, they explained that they would have to delete their email because they were scared the government was going to track them down in order to keep this all a secret as a part of a grand conspiracy. The entity that this rescuer described stood at about 15 feet in height and appeared hunched over in front of this person. And once it had taken to the skies, this person explained that it was around 30 feet in length and would go on to describe how unusually small the head was in comparison to the body, that the eyes were small and beady, and that its nose was purple, and then it had pointed ears protruding from the top of the head. Now, as it took off and ascended, the rescuer thought that the wingspan was actually too tiny to carry this massive thing, but then saw that the wingspan actually expanded out like a good 30 or 40 feet. As if the description of this thing wasn't disturbing enough, the rescuer then described it having 4 sets of hands, 2 large sets of claws that sat near the middle of the wings, very similar to that of a bat, and 2 hands attached to arms attached to a body, just the way a human would. In fact, the rescuer described it looking like this horrific demonic cross between a very large bat and a man. Now, for me personally, seeing something that's 30 feet tall ascending into the sky would be absolutely horrific, but my question is, if it was this large, wouldn't there have been other eyewitnesses? I mean, clearly this isn't just an isolated incident. And what's far more disturbing is that these sightings extend far beyond the reaches of Washington state. In fact, the mysterious bat-like entity that Brian, Butch, and the rescuer all described remains a mystery. There is much speculation about the origins of these bizarre, elusive creatures. Some theorize they're hiding away deep in the mountains and underground tunnels. Others believe they are the result of a government experiment accidentally released into the wild. Some believe all of this ties to the supposed secret underground lair that resides under the city of fallen angels, Los Angeles. In 1933, a man by the name of G. Warren Shufelt, a mining engineer from Los Angeles, California, had a bold claim to make. He had invented a revolutionary new device that could survey underground for valuable resources like oil, gold, and even subterranean cave and cavern systems. He called it the radio X-ray machine, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The machine looked like a pendulum suspended in a cylindrical glass case, which was placed inside a black box. According to one description, a plummet attached to a copper wire held by the engineer sways continually. Shufelt claimed that his machine could use radio X-rays to analyze the chemical, electrical, and physical properties of matter at great depths and up to several miles away. He never really explained how it all worked, but he assured everyone that it was based on a new discovered scientific principle. Greatly excited by the possibilities of this new invention, Shufelt began demonstrating his machine to investors and scientists in the area. He claimed that his machine had already discovered a vast, extensive network of underground tunnels and chambers beneath that very city of Los Angeles, which he believed belonged to house ancient secrets and potentially tons of treasure and artifacts. It was then that Shufelt, a curious man with a passion for exploration, began his quest for gold and other valuable treasures in the bustling city of LA. Armed with a mysterious device that he believed could detect precious materials, he combed through various parts of the city, hoping to strike it rich. He ventured beneath the heart of downtown Los Angeles, and he stumbled upon something truly remarkable. As he scanned the area with his device, he was astounded to find readings of a vast underground tunnel system stretching all the way from Mount Washington to Santa Monica Bay. What's more, the tunnels were not simply haphazardly arranged, but were meticulously and thoughtfully structured, complete with various rooms and large chambers of all kinds. Shufelt estimated that this vast labyrinth was large enough to comfortably house at least 5,000 people, if not more. But that wasn't even the most exciting part. Shufelt continued to explore and see, and he picked up on readings that indicated the presence of large amounts of gold hidden below in these passageways. Incredibly intrigued by this discovery, he set out to create a secret map of this now newfound underground world and began to try and make sense of what he had found. But he was still unsure of why there was a large labyrinth underneath Los Angeles. I knew I was over a pattern of tunnels, and I had mapped out the course of the tunnels, the position of large rooms scattered along the tunnel route, as well as the position of deposits of gold, but I couldn't understand the meaning of it. My radio X-ray pictures of tunnels and rooms which are subsurface voids, and of gold pictures with perfect corners, sides, and ends are scientific proof of their existence. However, the legendary story must remain speculative until unearthed by excavation. But before he truly started his excavation process, he wanted to seek out the wisdom of an old Hopi native leader known as Chief Little Greenleaf. Now, he had heard that Chief Little Greenleaf knew well about the ancient tunnel system and hoped he could provide some answers to the questions that had been weighing so heavily on his mind. Upon reaching Chief Little Greenleaf's village, he was welcomed with open arms and a warm fire, and after sharing a meal and some stories, he finally broached the subject of the ancient tunnel system. And after the chief told him all the wonders and artifacts that could lay beneath the city of Los Angeles, he was ecstatic and could not wait to prove it to the entirety of the world. In fact, Shufelt wasted no time and immediately began making plans to excavate the site. He was granted permission by the County Board of Supervisors to actually drill down into the depths of 1,000 feet, and he wasted no time in starting his excavation. So on February of 1934, Shufelt and his team began digging at a vacant lot on North Hill Street, right above what he believed to be a treasure room full of gold. Now, the city had agreed to give him half of any treasure that was found, which only fueled his enthusiasm. And because at the time of 1934, this was pretty remarkable news, so the media was soon abuzz with the news of this incredible discovery, the story of an ancient lost civilization, hidden treasure, full of gold, and who knows what else. This was all far too sensational to ignore. And as the excavation continued, it became a media circus, the public eagerly watching the progress. And they drilled and they drilled and they drilled and they dug deeper and deeper and deeper into the earth. And at 300 feet down, they encountered an abundance of mud, which therefore made these shafts unstable and threatened to collapse the tunnel. And as a result, they were forced to abort the excavation. And sadly, nothing of the underground city or its treasures were ever found. Now, despite the disappointing outcome, the legend of the underground city lived on for quite some time. But interest in the excavation soon fizzled out, and Schufeltz ran out of money and bankrupted himself. He eventually kind of just faded off and disappeared, and he would eventually pass away in North Hollywood in 1957. He died a poor man with no money. Over the years, the X-ray machine that he supposedly created and the map that he used to discover this underground labyrinth all just seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving no tangible evidence of this incredible discovery. Now, here's the twist. When Shufelt consulted with Chief Greenleaf, to his surprise, Chief Little Greenleaf began to weave quite the outlandish tale. He spoke of a lost civilization of people descended from the Mayans, who he called the lizard people. They supposedly worshipped the lizard as a symbol of a long life and lived all along the Pacific coast. This lost civilization was apparently extremely technologically and intellectually advanced, far beyond their time. They had all the manner of wondrous inventions and machines and incalculable wealth from gold and other materials. But their reign came to an end when, supposedly, an enormous meteor shower crashed down and rained on the earth roughly 5,000 years ago that nearly wiped out the entire race of these beings. Now, as he listened to Chief Little Greenleaf's story, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any truth to this. I mean, surely you don't just have an elaborate, organized tunnel systems with rooms for nothing. Could it be that the ancient tunnel system was somehow connected to this lost civilization? The mysterious tale of the survivors of a fiery catastrophe. According to him, these beings had all retreated to a series of underground cities that were carved into the earth using a secret chemical solution that could melt bedrock. These cities were allegedly reinforced using an unknown form of advanced concrete and were stocked with an abundance of supplies. But who were these inhabitants of these underground cities, you may ask? They were none other than the lizard people, a race of creatures rumored to have once inhabited the surface world. These beings had took all their gold and possessions and stowed them away, waiting for the safe time to resurface. What's more, there were not just one, but 3 underground cities built in the supposed shape of a lizard. One located under Los Angeles, another beneath Mount Shasta, and a third whose location was unknown. But the city under Los Angeles was said to be the largest and the capital of the 3. Among the many rooms of this underground city was a particularly important one, which Shufelt named the Key Room. Legend has it that this room held 37 massive slabs of gold, each measuring 4 feet long and 14 inches wide. But what was even more intriguing was the belief that in this room held the complete records of the origins of the human race. The radio X-ray has revealed the location of one of 3 lost cities on the Pacific coast. The local one, having been dug by the lizard people after the Great Catastrophe, which occurred about 5,000 years ago. This this legendary catastrophe was in the form of a huge tongue of fire which came out of the southwest, destroying all life in its path, the path being several hundred miles wide. The city underground was dug as a means of escaping future fires. Large rooms in the domes of the hills above the city of Labyrinths housed 1,000 families in the manner of tall buildings, and imperishable food supplies of the herb variety were stored in the catacombs to provide sustenance for the lizard folk for great lengths of time. It's speculated by some that he was encroaching into very dangerous conspiratorial territory by discovering this reptilian city. So his device, his map, and anything about him pretty much just vanished and was quickly swept under the rug as a failure to the scientific community. Others simply speculate that he just struck bad luck with the mud and was never able to discover what really lurks beneath. Los Angeles. And so the mystery of the lost city of the reptilians remains just that, a mystery. It makes you wonder if he tapped into something he shouldn't have, and they were quick to cover their tracks behind the scenes, making it appear as if he'd uncovered nothing. After all, if I was safeguarding a secret of that caliber, I'd do everything in my power to do the same. But what if that secret actually resides in a canyon full of mysteries? A place that's said to be even more mysterious and deadly than the infamous Nahanni Valley. You decide. What would you do if you had wandered into a canyon known for phantoms that appear out of nowhere, dog people that supposedly live and hide underground and eat people, and bizarre UFO and light anomalies, amongst other mysterious creatures? Well, there's a place like that, and it's called Fraser Canyon. Indigenous people have been warning about it for centuries, and I will share this accursed place's history, stories, and legends in today's episode, so let's get into it. In 1961, this article in Fate magazine called Phantom of the Caribou Trail told a pretty odd story set during the Fraser Canyon gold rush right around 1858 to 1860 and the Caribou Gold Rush in 1861. So imagine this, over 10,000 miners and many other folks just flooding the area, like totally desperate to find gold and make their dreams come true. So the British Army's Royal Engineers, being as cool as they were, actually built this crazy dangerous wagon trail along these insane mountain cliffs, and they called it the Caribou Road. One of the very first prospectors to embark on this really sketchy journey was a man by the name of John Fillmore. Now listen to this. During the summer of 1861, Fillmore was navigating the Caribou Road with 50 pack mules loaded with supplies for all of these miners out there. These guys were camped out near the spot called Spencer's Bridge, and that's when weird stuff really started to happen. Now, this article claims that this very bizarre white light just appeared in the sky at night when everybody was sleeping, except for the guard they set up. It was moving back and forth like it was searching for something, and then mysteriously, just vanished. The guard didn't report anything else strange that night, but when morning came, well, 3 of their mules were straight up gone as they had just vanished into thin air. Another prospector named George Lateau made camp near Yale when he too witnessed these strange, weird-looking lights that seemed to dance in a half circle above him, disappearing into the night. Now, just like Fillmore, the very next morning, Lateau woke up to find that 3 of his pack mules had vanished without a trace as well. So was this the work of some strange force that had taken Fillmore's animals? Now, it wasn't long before word had spread and the tale of the so-called Caribou Phantom started to emerge among the miners in the area, with hushed whispers of even more people who had gone missing in similar strange circumstances. Now, some people were convinced that this Caribou Phantom was the work of restless spirits, bizarre creatures from another world, or maybe even demons lurking in the shadows. But of course, others were skeptical. I mean, they believed it was probably just vivid imaginations playing tricks on these miners, or even the work of a cunning group of bandits preying on the unsuspecting travelers. And so at one point, this group of determined locals got together and formed a posse with one goal in mind. They would go out and find the truth behind these mysterious disappearances once and for all. Now, the night this posse made camp along the trail, all men had little sleep. They were on high alert because these white lights started moving above them, just like in previous stories. But other than that, nothing else really stood out as unusual. At least not according to the guards that were keeping a close eye out for any signs of danger. And when morning came, it seemed like the caribou phantom had struck again. 3 more mules were missing, just vanished without a trace. And so another attempt to capture this phantom had come up empty. So what exactly was going on here? Are we talking about ghosts, phantoms, and UFOs, or is this simply a product of some creative journalism that was so common back then? Now, it's hard to say for sure, but one thing is certain, this isn't the only case of bizarre occurrences in the Fraser Canyon. Now, similar to these men's accounts of what they would describe as a phantom, a man by the name of Peter Santoro would describe his horrifying account with some sort of similar entity. Now, Peter had been a resident of Fraser Canyon since he was a child. The place had always been a hotbed for strange occurrences and unexplainable phenomena. As a paranormal researcher and ufologist, he had spent countless hours investigating these mysteries, but nothing could have prepared him for what would have happened. Now, as Peter was settling into bed for the night, he heard a strange noise that he couldn't quite discern. Now, he would describe it like a soft, rhythmic tapping, kind of like claws hitting wood. Now, he simply dismissed it as one of his dogs wandering around the house, but when he turned to face the sound, he was met with the sight that will forever scar him, because standing in the corner of his room was an entity unlike anything he'd ever seen. Now, he described it as humanoid in shape, but its features were far from human. He described it having skin that was sickly green, and it had these scales that almost seemed to shimmer in the reflection of light. He described a pair of small horns protruding from its head and a face that was a grotesque mix of insect and demon. He described its eyes glowing like this almost Christmas light red, were his words. And the teeth he described were almost fish-like but looked metallic. To further add to the strange horror, this being also was adorned in a black uniform of sorts with a symbol that Peter couldn't recognize. This thing held a strange object in its hand resembling a wand or a pen. Its other hand ended in a sharp single claw, but what struck Peter the most was its expression. It was grinning this wicked, evil grin that completely paralyzed Peter. Now, Peter describes he tried to scream out for help, but nothing came out. He was unable to move anything out of his entire body. Now, the more and more terrified Peter visibly became, this thing seemed to really enjoy it, like it was getting off on him, being absolutely terrified, completely demonic in nature. This thing began to step towards Peter, and that's when he described that everything just completely whited out. Now, eventually Peter came to, and he was all alone in his room. The only evidence of it ever being in the room were these strange markings on his skin that he described looked like large claw marks. After that night, he had troubles sleeping for God knows how many weeks after, and he always felt a weird connection to the mirror in his room. Maybe connection isn't the word, but maybe had a strange feeling about it, so much so there was so much negativity around it, he actually had to physically remove the mirror from his room. In the weeks that would transpire, Peter was plagued with horrific nightmares, sleepless nights, and what he would describe as horrific and bizarre heart palpitations. He feels that whatever this entity was had marked Peter in some way and did something to him internally, but he can't say what. All he can do is just live with this experience. What do you guys think of Peter's story? Now, let me introduce you to another individual, a Scots-Canadian anthropologist by the name of James Tate. Now, this guy spent years living among and researching the indigenous Thompson tribe in this same area and uncovered quite a few bone-chilling tales and mysterious creatures right around these parts. Now, one such story that he had come across talked about this race of dog people that get this, supposedly live underground in a complex network of tunnels not too far from a Thompson Indian village called Spuzum, and it's right there at the lower end of the Fraser Canyon. Now, Tate shares this eerie description of these dog people. The dog people lived in an underground lodge near Spuzum. Now, their house was called the Caxielix and had a false door. So strangers, upon entering and when about to leave the bottom of the ladder to step on the floor, would tumble down into a pit of great depth, where they were killed and eaten by the dog people, who would never come forward except for night. I mean, can you imagine? It's like something straight out of a horror movie. And it makes you wonder what other strange and terrifying secrets are hiding deep within the Fraser Canyon. The world is always weird, and sometimes the line between reality and fiction is thinner than we might think. Now, there are more horrors than just dog people. There's also this terrifying tale about a race of giants that supposedly used to wander the land. The Thompson people mention that these beings were once pretty standard, but around the 1850s and 60s, they just disappeared right when the Fraser Canyon gold rush happened. Imagine that. Now, these giants were massive, standing at a freakishly 30 feet tall. This is not even 30 feet. They would drape themselves in animal skins and holes in caves hidden behind cliffs. They only came down when they needed to hunt for food, and they would do so by running in massive strides, their hands reaching out to strangle their prey with their crazy strength. You would think that animals that large would be easy to spot. Well, the thing is, they had a way of hiding. But even if you couldn't see them, these giants had this smell about them. It was a pungent scent that can make your stomach turn. It was said to linger in the air for miles around. In fact, Tate described these giants in his writings like this. According to the beliefs of the Upper Thompsons, giants about 30 feet tall inhabit the Okanagan country and were numerous in the Upper Thompson until the 1850s and 60s. The Lower Thompsons believe that these giants do not live in their own country, but come down occasionally from that of the Okanagan and Upper Thompsons. Now check out what they said the giants could do. They could carry a grizzly bear or an elk on their backs with the greatest ease. The smallest of these creatures is 4 or 5 times the height and strength of an ordinary man, while the largest is only comparable to trees. They can carry 4 large buck deer on their backs at one time with the greatest ease, and it is said that one of them killed 2 black bears and shoved them one into each side of his belt, as an ordinary man would do with 2 squirrels. Yikes, I would not want to encounter that. Now, humanoid giants aren't the only giant creatures said to inhabit the canyon, because back in 2005, a 21-year-old man named Raymond had a terrifying encounter of his own. Now, in 2005, Raymond was a 21-year-old man working at a remote logging camp in the Fraser Canyon in British Columbia. The camp was a rugged, self-sufficient community of about 20 or so men nestled in the heart of the Canadian wilderness. They were a motley crew of lumberjacks, cooks, mechanics, and others who would keep the camp running. And their days were filled with hard work, and their nights were spent around the campfire, just settling down, de-stemming from the day under the sky. Now, this camp in particular was located near the edge of the dense forest, with the mighty Fraser River flowing nearby. Now, where they were miles away from the nearest town, and their only connection to the outside world was a single unreliable radio. It was a harsh, isolated existence, but they were a rather tight-knit group and they looked out for each other. Now, it was one evening when Raymond was on firewood duty, because he had always enjoyed this task as it allowed him to be alone with his thoughts and the serene beauty of the wilderness. However, that night, as he was chopping wood near the edge of the camp, he noticed something very unusual up on the ridgeline about 200 yards away. It was a massive, oversized silhouette, much larger than any animal he had ever seen. Now, as Raymond squinted to get a better look, he realized that it was a bird perched on a large boulder. But this was no ordinary bird. I mean, it was enormous, easily over 7 feet tall, its form outlined against the fading night. It was still almost statuesque, as if surveying the landscape below. Its feathers were shimmering in the dying light, reflecting hues of pink, gold, and red. Now, Raymond, of course, was incredibly awestruck by this sight, and he had heard stories of the Thunderbird. Now, this was a legendary indigenous creature that was said to bring with it bad omens like storms, among a host of other things. But he claimed that as he sat there looking at this thing, he just felt this strange calm wash over him, as if this being realized he was down there and this thing was comforting him, or so he described. Now, what he describes next would take his breath away. He would see it open its wingspan and take off into the night so quickly and completely vanish that he would describe its appearance as completely awe-inspiring and breathtaking. Now, Raymond would actually go and share this experience with a few indigenous elders who would occasionally come and visit their camp. Now, after talking with a few of the elders, they would confirm that yes, he did indeed see a Thunderbird, which is supposedly a powerful spirit creature rarely if ever seen by humans. Raymond considers himself extremely fortunate to witness such a spectacle. I mean, it's not often that people see things like that. He describes it as a profound connection with the supernatural world. Now, only a year later in the winter of 2006, he had another encounter which would further cement his belief in the supernatural. This time, it was a particularly harsh winter and the camp was blanketed with snow. The days were short, the nights were long, and the biting cold often kept them trying to keep everything as warm as possible. Now, one evening, after working a very long day, Raymond decided to walk along the riverbank. As the night was young, the moon was full, and it was kind of one of those nights where the moon was out and it was so bright that it actually illuminated everything. And so Raymond stops and notices this pulsating white light on a different ridge out in the distance, and he swears he could see it flying with wings off in a different direction and realizes that it's the same figure he saw the year prior. And as it was flying off from the ridge, it would change in different hues from white to blue to green, almost in otherworldly shades and hues of color. He could vividly recall that the feathers almost had this ethereal glow or light to them, and that the sighting was so awe-inspiring it caused him to stand there right in the spot, transfixed on this entity with wings clearly disappearing from view in the night sky, because when you see something like that with the darkness all around you, there ain't no way that that's not gonna stand out. Of course, he didn't tell anybody else who he worked with, and he's not sure if he's the only one who's seen this thing, but Raymond likes to believe that he's one of the few that has gotten a glance of the supernatural realm, and that seeing this entity 2 separate times is a sign of great significance. Now, a Bailey Myers also experienced something she could not explain in 2001 while camping right around the Nahatlatch River. The incident appeared in Fraser Canyon at the farthest reaches of the Nahatlatch River campground at campsite number 7. And so Bailey ensured they got the most remote spot where one could dump camp. Bailey wanted solitude away from the hustle and bustle, so it was quiet and rather lonely, surrounded by the serenity of the forest. Now, around 3 in the morning, just like that, Bailey wakes up, she turns to her husband and asks him what was wrong, because she could sense there was clearly something going on, and he was frightened. So when Bailey was pressing and asking why, he kept claiming he heard a strange noise from the forest. Now, usually, Bailey would just tell him to go back to sleep, like a traditional response, but she could sense that something was different, and almost instantaneously, a chorus of owls began hooting one after the other non-stop. Then the coyotes joined in, and with their eerie howls, every bird in the vicinity woke up and joined in the cacophony. And this went on for about an entire minute. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped, and Bailey knew this was not normal. And then they heard it. Thud, thud, thud. Branches were snapping, wood was cracking with each step, and Bailey began thinking, okay, that's a biped, but a human, unless they were trying to scare them, wouldn't be stomping around like that. An adult would know better, knowing that people might be armed. Besides, the terrain needed to be more treacherous for a casual nighttime stroll, with no guarantee of encountering someone to frighten. Now, during the day, the forest was too dense for hunting, and Bailey knew there were no bears. It wasn't a deer or any other familiar woodland creature, but whatever it was kept getting closer and closer. So Bailey knew that she should cough loudly just to see if whoever it was out there would realize, hey, we hear you. Whatever it was kept going. And she noted the steps as heavy and laborious, full of grunts, and these steps were very loud. So now Bailey gets up, knowing the flashlight was left in their truck, so she runs out there, she's rummaging around for it, looking for it, and there, right there in the glove box, she finds the flashlight, she's scanning around, she's looking for whatever is making this noise, and as soon as she starts scanning her surroundings, it stops. Everything becomes quiet around them. Now Bailey begins to start the vehicle and points the headlights towards the woods. And they put the high beams on, right? So it is shining really bright. She's looking for any signs of movement. She's trying to be as quiet as possible. She sees nothing. Now she notices something else immediately, that the forest around them is dead quiet, and you could hear a pin drop. She feels the prickles of nervousness and fear all over her body. Something is very wrong. And then cutting through the silence like a knife through butter, she hears this loud, this exhale that was deeper than she had ever heard. She described it like a sigh of an elephant or a boar in a man, something that she could not explain. And with that, she runs back in the tent, leaving the car with the high beams facing the forest where the noise was coming from. And so it's safe to say that Bailey and her husband didn't get much sleep that night at all. And in fact, a few hours later, in the middle of the night, they convinced themselves just to get up, run in the truck, drive off, and they would return back in the morning for their tent and supplies. Now, is it possible at all that the giants that's described in the Fraser Canyon actually might be more akin to hairy beasts like Bigfoot? In fact, there is a very specific chief by the name of Chief Dick, who was a Thompson elder, and apparently he was deep in a hunting trip in the woods on the mountains east of Spuzzum when he saw something strange he could not account for. The village elder, Annie York, gave an account, and it reads this: Chief Dick's eyesight was unfailing, his nerves were solid as a boulder, and he wasn't a man given to imagination. The animal, human, or whatever it was, appeared to sense the hunter's presence. This did little to pacify his fears, and for full minutes, Chief Dick prayed and pondered whether to retreat or shoot. Despite his great anxiety and agitation, he noted that the other being resembled a human or man with generally gray medium hair, covering it from head to feet and displaying massive width of shoulders with long, powerful arms. The face, he states, was hairy and wide, and the eyes piercing and searching in their probing efforts to locate his position. A slight movement on the part of the hunter climaxed the suspense, and as Chief Dick watched as he never had before, the great creature faded silently from sight and was soon lost among the shadows of the timber. Now, the legend goes that Chief Dick had went and gathered a hunting party and then would later return to the scene, and this is supposedly where they would find gigantic footprints, and get this, they would describe it as nearly twice the size of their own. Now, what's very interesting is a reverend by the name of John Boothgood, who was a missionary, would also write about such tales and claims, and he too had heard many of these stories during his time in the Fraser Canyon, which was right around 1866 to 1882. And he would write this: on 3 different occasions in successive years, and in entirely different points of observation, the most startling reports were circulated far and wide that when camping out for purposes of hunting, fishing, gathering wood and berries, certain of our Indians had been visited in the dead of night by something that seemed half man, half beast, which had come into the tents while sleeping or prowled around their encampment, producing the greatest consternation and amazement. The idea prevailed that certain wild men of the woods were at large in the less frequented parts of the country and were exceedingly dangerous and might one day invade settlements. Now, it's probably no surprise to a lot of you that this whole area, Fraser Canyon, has been a hotbed of Sasquatch and Bigfoot sightings and reports. So could these writings be alluding to that? Now, what's really interesting is, in addition to all these strange creatures and phantoms, including giants, there were also supposedly dwarves that lived in this canyon. And in fact, going back to Tate for a second, he would even write about it. And he would say this: "They are just like men, but their skins are pale and their bodies are very gaunt. They are only about 2 feet tall. They wander around the mountains, sometimes shouting, groaning, or weeping. Their eyes are sunk very deep into their heads. They run away from hunters and go into inaccessible places. The lower Thompsons say they can make themselves visible or invisible at will. According to their ideas, dwarf women do not exceed 3 feet in height. However, a few of the men are tall, surpassing the tallest Indians in stature, but none are of medium size. All wear clothes similar to those formerly worn by the Indians, but have never been seen with bows and arrows. They are rather fond of joking and playing tricks on people. Also, regarding these strange pale entities lurking about, they are the same size and height as ordinary people, but naked, and of ghost color. They are gaunt, the shape of all their bones and joints visible. Their eyes are huge and round and protrude from their heads. Like ghosts, they chase people but are more persistent. Another creature is a human body of white color, without any limbs, which occasionally rolls over the ground, uttering cries like an infant. A person who sees any of these monsters will die shortly afterward." Now, my thoughts revolve around the time frame this information was being written. If this was all a hoax and was faked, why? Now, indeed, these men truly encountered and saw things that, by our natural laws of nature, shouldn't exist. Is it possible there could be portals that lead to other dimensions in this very canyon? Well, a fascinating letter surfaced that would describe what a man by the name of Robert would witness: a ritual being performed that opened up portals of beings coming out into the open. I bear witness to the following account shared with me by Robert Y., a Fraser Canyon, British Columbia resident. Robert, a retired logger, had lived in the area since 1985. He was a man of few words, but his words carried weight when he spoke. I met Robert during a community meeting in 2007 where he shared this chilling account with me. I was a minister in Vancouver for a decade and have been a history teacher for 20 years. I have also been involved in campaigns against child labor, sweatshops, modern-day slavery, and genocide in Sudan. I have also written several books. One evening, as we sat by a campfire near his cabin, Robert pointed towards the dense forest and said, "There's something not right about this place. I've seen things I can't explain." His voice was steady, but his eyes held a haunted look. He described an event that took place in the summer of 1985. He had returned home late from work when he stumbled upon a clearing in the woods. In the clearing, he saw a group of people cloaked in black gathered around a large stone. They were chanting in a language he couldn't understand. Then suddenly, the air around them started to shimmer and several portals opened up. From these portals, demonic beings emerged, their forms grotesque and terrifying. The beings moved around the clearing. Their movements were unnatural and jerky. Robert described the creatures in vivid detail. They had elongated bodies, their skin a sickly green hue. Their eyes glowed red in the dim light, and they had sharp, jagged teeth. He could see the fear in the eyes of the people in the clearing as they continued their ritual, seemingly unable to stop. Robert was frozen in fear, unable to move or look away. He felt a cold dread seeping into his bones as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't know how long he stood there watching the horrifying spectacle, but the sun was starting to rise when he finally managed to tear his gaze away and run. Robert's voice was steady when he shared his story with me, but his hands trembled slightly. He had lived in Fraser Canyon all his life and heard stories of strange occurrences, but he had never experienced anything like this. He believed Fraser Canyon was a hot spot for paranormal activity, and his experience confirmed this. I share this story hoping that someone reading it who has witnessed similar events in Fraser Canyon might come forward and clarify what happened that night. Then in 1990, an anonymous man and his son encountered what they believe was an unknown alpha predator. The father and his son had been hunting in Fraser Canyon for years, and it was their tradition, their bonding time. But that day, in 1990, was unlike any other. The mist was thicker than usual, blanketing the river and the surrounding woods. Now, the blind, their makeshift shelter, was the only place they felt somewhat safe. And the father remembers how scared he was when his son was shaking him awake. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling on his shoulder. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "It's back. neck. Now the father strained his ears, and sure enough, he could hear it. The sound of something very large moving through the underbrush, snapping everything under its tremendous weight. It was closer than before, and it was now moving fast. The ground beneath them trembled with every heavy step they could hear, and whatever it was now getting very close. Now, he had heard of strange things going on in Fraser Canyon, but this was completely different because growing up, he had always dismissed them as folklore and tales that others would share to outsiders. But now him and his son were sitting in this blind, listening, just listening, and they could hear this growling and grunting outside. Whatever it was let out a scream, and it made their blood run cold. It wasn't just a sound of a shriek or a scream, but something of pure rage, warning them that they were in territory that was not theirs. The man's son was in tears, clutching onto his father for dear life. All the father could do was just hold him and hold him close as he's thinking and his mind is racing for a plan. But whatever had let out that screech very close to their deer stand had now quickly disappeared, and the forest around them fell completely silent. In fact, the only sound you could hear was the soft lapping of the river against the shore, and they didn't dare move or breathe until they were sure that whatever had made this noise was completely gone. And so that was the last time they would ever go hunting in Fraser Canyon, and they would not speak of that day, but the memory would haunt both of them. Now, this canyon isn't exclusive to strange creatures. In fact, there are a lot of weird energies and hauntings all around the canyon, nestled within this place called Hell's Gate. It's this super narrow passageway between the towering rock walls of Fraser Canyon. So just imagine the canyon walls rising about 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet above the river. But even though it is such an ominous name, Hell's Gate is a very touristy hotspot. People traveling the Gold Rush Trail can enjoy their air tram ride through the canyon, taking in all its beauty. But here's the thing, this place is said to be crawling with ghosts and angry spirits. Now, this airstream has attracted some strange spooks. There's this gift shop, and people often report seeing the spirit of a small woman wearing a bonnet and an old-fashioned blue dress hanging around. But it doesn't stop there. They say that you can also catch the smell of fresh apple pie when she's about. A ghost who enjoys baking, imagine that. Then there's other ghosts. An Asian man who's usually seen on the deck. Some say he's the spirit of a Chinese immigrant worker who had died during the gold rush era. And there's also this sad, lonely little girl that sometimes wanders around the halls of the upper terminal. But it gets even stranger. In the restaurant, you might spot a ghostly man just leisurely smoking a cigar in the far corner. And perhaps the eeriest of all, there's a dark and shadowy figure that's seen lurking below the deck near the gold panning station, and he's got these two red-eyed dogs on a leash. Pretty creepy. Not to mention the dead, restless spirits of the miners who still wander the area. And Hell's Gate is so devilishly treacherous that it boasts its body count. Its turbulent waters, forced through a channel of only 110 feet wide, have claimed the lives of countless people. In fact, in the early 20th century, when railroad construction inadvertently led to rock slides that blocked the natural passage of migrating salmon, millions of fish perished trying to cross the severe bottleneck in Fraser River, sparking an ecological crisis of apocalyptic proportions. But the dark past of Hell's Gate doesn't end there. Some say that its malevolent energy extends beyond the physical realm into the paranormal, if you believe in such things. Now let's dive into some of those terrifying encounters. There's a local legend often talked about among area residents, and they tell of the infamous Hell's Gate poltergeist. A supposed demonic spirit allegedly torments victims, particularly those who work and visit the nearby Hell's Gate air tram. Reports of objects moving seemingly independently and ghostly apparitions lurking at the edge of one's vision are all eerily familiar. In fact, one tram operator recalls discovering a raven's lifeless, mangled body lying on the floor of an electrical room. After disposing of the carcass, the operator seized by an unexplainable feeling of dread. Throughout the night, they became plagued by strange, violent nightmares. Many believe that the spirit of that wretched bird may have sought vengeance on the tram operator for disturbing the delicate balance at the threshold of Hell's Gate. Now, Ed, a local man had his own bizarre experience while near Hell's Gate. Now, Ed had never been one to put pen to paper, but after what he had seen, he would feel compelled to share his story. Now, of course, he was no stranger to the unusual, but what he encountered that night in 2009 near Hell's Gate was beyond anything he could have imagined. He had always been a rather rational man, a firm believer in what could be seen and touched, but he was about to be shaken to the core, because Hell's Gate, a narrow gorge in the Fraser River, was a place Ed knew quite well. He had spent countless summers there as a child, fishing with his father, listening to his father's tales of strange happenings. Now, his father always had a penchant for the supernatural, a trait Ed never inherited until that night, he claims. So it was a typical summer evening. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant sound of the rivers, and Ed was busy driving back from a friend's place, the road ahead illuminated only by the faint glow of his headlights. And as he rounded a bend, the headlights caught something in the middle of the road. At first, Ed thought it was a bear, but as he slowed down, he realized it was something else entirely. It was a creature with a massive body covered in dark, matted, mangy, disgusting fur. He described the shoulders as broad and muscular with pointed ears, but not unlike a German shepherd. But what struck Ed the most were its hands. They were almost human-like, clutching what appeared to be a dead rabbit. In fact, he would describe the hands being very similar to that of a raccoon, and immediately he could feel full body paralysis as he's trying to watch and process what's going on, his mind struggling to make sense. And this thing was standing perfectly still. It lifts up its head and it responds to him, looking in his direction. Instinctively, Ed then flicks on the high beams and it lights up the creature's orangey, fiery eyes. But in the harsh light, it would slowly rise up its arm to shield its eyes from the bright light. But the intensity that burned within this being's eyes almost seemed demonic. And this was when it got worse, because as it's shielding its eyes, the thing fully stands erect, and now Ed is terrifying seeing its unnatural movements. It acted awkward and disjointed and uncoordinated. And Ed recalls hearing this wet popping sound as it stood up on its hind legs, and then it charges at his vehicle. Out of sheer reaction, Ed floors the accelerator, turns his car, and swerves it, almost going right into the woods. The creature veers past his car, and Ed floors it. He doesn't stop driving until he reaches his cabins. His hands are shaking. His breathing's out of control. He didn't sleep at all that night. He can barely process what was happening. He had nightmares for days afterwards, and it wasn't until a couple of days later that he tried to confide in a close friend who clearly dismissed it as he was just tired, he was exhausted, he clearly saw a bear, but I mean, guys, come on. For those of us that have seen bear and know what bear look like, this was not a bear. It was something that defied explanation. And it's been many years since this happened, and so he's kind of just kept it under wraps and not really wanted to talk about it. Now, Ed knew that Hell's Gate has always been a place of supernatural mystery with all the strange things that happened, and so he's really not surprised that he would have a sighting like that near this area where he believes there's other strange things going on. Now, why does all of this seem to be so attached to Hell's Gate? Well, it's tough to say, but that's not the only haunted place in the entire region. There's also this lake nestled between three mountains near Foster's Bar, and people claim that the strangest things also happen there. This eerie place, ladies and gentlemen, is known as Devil's Lake, and it is believed to be full of powerful spirits, according to the legends passed down by generations of natives. As a result, they've always been cautious when passing by the lake, and even today, they continue the ritual of blackening their faces to avoid being recognized by the devil said to be lurking in the lake. But that's not all, because the tales go on about herds of goats transforming into stone, young maidens meeting their untimely deaths while swimming, and get this, a bull with a dog on its head attempting to swim across the lake, vanishing halfway without a trace. What adds to the overall fear surrounding Devil's Lake is the Lillooet tribe's tradition of an ancient evil woman believed to reside at the lake. With long, eerie hair, she is known to float around on a log, chanting, singing songs that nobody understands, and to avoid being spotted by this demonic entity, people would cover any exposed skin with ash as they pass by the lake. Now, legend has it that anyone, or any creature for that matter, who dares to enter the waters of the Devil's Lake vanishes. Although this evil older woman is said to dwell within the lake, she's also known to wander the land, searching for souls to prey upon. People have also reported seeing strange canine humanoid creatures, among other things. It's evident that by all of these tales of strangeness, there is surely something about this canyon. Is there a supernatural energy surrounding it, much like something like Skinwalker Ranch, or is there something else going on that deals with the very fabric of our reality? If any of what was in that episode is even remotely true, then we're dealing with absolute living legends that were thought to be myth and folklore. Another location that's steeped in mystery and darkness is New Orleans. Sure, I can make an entire video on the history of how dark this place is, but we'll save that for another time. The absolute horror behind this place is the men this woman encountered years ago. Worse, they weren't human. Early in the 20th century, the bustling city of New Orleans stood as a beacon of prosperity and excitement, drawing people from all corners of the globe. Along with its fertile economy, the city also gave birth to a thriving cultural landscape, with the vibrant notes of jazz filling the air and eclectic mix of residents contributing to its colorful atmosphere. But beneath the glitz and glamour, a darker side lurked within the city's shadows, a chilling tale of terror that seemed to defy our very reality, but yet would strike fear into the hearts of those who had heard it. Now, as dusk descended upon the city one fateful evening in 1932, a police officer patrolling Royal Street found himself startled by an unusual sight. A young girl in her 20s, appearing frail and disoriented, walked aimlessly down the street, her wrist bearing the marks of deep cuts that still were oozing with fresh blood. Now, the concerned officer approached the girl, intent on offering her assistance and uncovering the source of her distress. But he listened with growing unease as the girl recounted her harrowing experience. She claimed to have been held captive by two men who sought refuge in the shadows of the city's darkest corners. The girl described the horrifying ordeal that she and several others had endured, having been mercilessly shackled and their wrists sliced open. Her captors had underestimated her willpower and resourcefulness, for she found an opportune moment to free herself and free from her clutches. But for her, the nightmare was pretty far from over, but the danger remained for others still imprisoned by these sickos. And understandably so, the officer was very skeptical of such a ridiculous story. But as this officer was looking into her eyes and seeing how genuine her account was, not to mention she was pretty physically battered, he knew something horrid had occurred. But just wait, because the twist is going to blow you away. Now, with a deep sense of duty, he called in backup and ventured into the dwelling in question. The girl insisted that others might still be in danger and that he couldn't ignore the possibility. The officers followed her to a house on the corner of Royal and St. Anne in the vibrant French Quarter. The residence belonged to two rather unassuming dock workers, John and Wayne Carter, who were known as mild-mannered men who kept to themselves, hardly the monstrous culprits she described. But they have a nasty, dark secret that I'm just about to unveil, so hold on. Now, when they arrived at the quiet home, there was no response to the knocks on the door. Fearing the worst, the police cautiously entered the dark abode, flashlights piercing the shadows, and what they discovered within would haunt their dreams. The smell alone was a warning, though it could not prepare the officers for the nightmarish scene they would find. 4 people were tied to chairs, their wrists slashed, still bleeding profusely, each one a reflection of the girl's own condition. It was apparent that some effort had been made to treat their wounds, but it was a cruel mockery of care. One was barely clinging to life, in desperate need of immediate medical attention. Now, surrounding the captives were bloody cups, as if the macabre residue of a twisted dinner party. The blood was still fresh. The captors must have sipped it from the cups, just as the girl had claimed. Now, these horrifying details made it clear that the stories held far more truth than what was comfortable. As if the grotesque scene was not enough, the officers stumbles upon another room, a chamber of horrors, where 15 more people lie with their wrists slashed and bloodied. Some still clung to life, suffering in silence, while the others were hidden beneath stained sheets, long past saving. You could imagine the odor and a cacophony of flies buzzing nearby with the dark, dank, and humid conditions, drawn to the sickly sweet scent of death. And yet the Carter brothers, the orchestrators, were nowhere to be found. Resolving to capture the fiendish duo, the officers devised an ambush. 10 of New Orleans' finest people gathered within the house, preparing to bring an end to the horror perpetrated by these seemingly normal men. In that dreadful house, the officers lay in wait, fueled by a desire for justice. Unbeknownst to them, this was just the beginning of a tale that would forever tear at the fabric of New Orleans. Now, the story goes that the police eventually found the Carter brothers, but spoke about how such small men possessed unnatural strength and power for their size. Because as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the city was now blanketed in darkness, locals could hear the chaos unfolding on that fateful evening. When the police had cornered the Carter brothers, these seemingly unassuming men put up a fierce battle. Despite standing just around 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing under 160, they easily took on the might of 10 burly big police officers, tossing them around like toys and even dispatching a few of their opponents into unconsciousness. Some even say that the brothers successfully fought off the officers before performing a supernatural leap from a balcony and escaping into the shadows of the night like feral beasts. Regardless of the varying details, the Carter brothers were eventually captured and promptly confessed to a vicious and unbelievable truth. Now here we go, this is the twist. They claim they were apparently immortal vampires with an insatiable hunger for blood. The brothers even coldly informed their captors that they could only be killed by fire or decapitation, suggesting that the police must execute such forms of justice or else face the brothers' relentless killing spree in their quest for blood. In the end, they were tried, found guilty of murder, and hanged. Now, it seemed that the hangman's noose was just as effective as fire and decapitation in bringing down these so-called vampires. However, the story doesn't necessarily end with their deaths. Terrified now by the rumors of vampires in their midst, the horrified locals demanded the two bodies be exhumed. And to the shock and disbelief of everyone around, the coffins were found empty, prompting fears that the brothers had somehow survived and escaped to hunt once more. Now, the dark legend of the Carter brothers festers like an open wound in New Orleans still. Whispers persisted that 2 of their surviving victims spiraled into madness and became serial killers themselves. One of them, known as Felipe, claimed the lives of 32 people before vanishing without a trace, leaving behind a diary recounting dreams and fantasies of blood. Now, another unnamed victim laid waste to hundreds of lives in a deranged killing spree. Other victims were not driven to murder, but madness took hold of them just the same, and they spent the rest of their lives confined to asylums. Now, as the years passed and the city began to grow, sightings of the Carter brothers continue to happen. But to this day, in the modern age, as the shadows lengthen and our twilight descends, old fears do resurface and people do still nervously glance over their shoulders, wondering if they might be next to encounter the immortal vampires that once wreaked havoc upon New Orleans. Now, the tale of 2 brothers, John and Wayne Carter, who were accused of being modern-day vampires, killing victims and drinking their blood, does have its holes. I mean, this chilling story from the 1930s sounds like from something straight out of a horror novel. But is it really true or simply an internet fabrication? I mean, some elements of the story are just too good to be ignored, like the chilling account of how the brothers were supposedly discovered surrounded by the drained bodies of their victims. But there are many problematic aspects. I mean, for starters, It's difficult to verify whether the Carter brothers ever actually existed. I mean, there are no details about where they were buried or their full names of their so-called victims. Now, additionally, in-depth research was actually conducted by a Courtney Mroch, yielded no evidence of this story ever appearing in newspapers from that era. Mroch shared her findings, saying she could not find any official executions of John and Wayne Carter, and that the story seemed to be entirely fabricated. I pressed on with my research. Papers love sensational, weird, and wild stories, regardless of the decade. I gave it the benefit of a doubt and thought about how to research it from another angle. I even checked deathpenaltyusa.org. No men named Carter were executed from 1911 to 1932 either. Moreover, considering the supernatural elements of the story, Mroch concluded that not only did these events probably never happen, but it's also likely that the story itself had stemmed from a simple internet urban legend. So, is this a story of real modern-day vampires in New Orleans, or just a tall tale spinning from the depths of the internet? Is there really any truth to this horrifying account? Well, to this day, there's been nothing definitive to prove it either false or true, and so the case does remain unsolved to this day. While there is certainly doubt about the authenticity of the tale I just shared, no one can deny the demonic events that surrounded Highgate, London years ago. In fact, what took place caused such a stir that the public around Highgate was scared to go out at night. Additionally, mysterious flying entities have also been spotted above a church in Monnon located in Cornwall, England. While these are two separate events I will share with you, I can't help but suspect they both share the exact sinister origins. One night, in the early 1960s, a wave of panic swept through the streets of Highgate. Rumors had spread that something strange and potentially sinister was lurking in the shadows of its famous cemetery. Tales of ghostly figures performing bizarre occult rituals had sent chills down the spines of many local residents. Although Highgate had always been known for its hauntings, this particular apparition was soon picked up by both local and national news outlets. Fear began to spread throughout the suburb as people tried desperately to make sense of what was happening. Could it really be true? Was there really a vampire on the loose? One of the very first documented sightings showed up in the early 60s by a young couple as they strolled home along Swains Lane. The couple were in for a shocking surprise. It was early 1963, and the Highgate Cemetery had been left to decay over a century. Its Gothic Victorian gravestone looming ominously in the moonlight. As they passed through the north gate of the graveyard, or by it, something caught their eye, an eerie figure standing motionless among the tombstones. The figure seemed to be staring right at them, and before either one of them could react, they were both frozen with fear. And they remained rooted to the spot for what felt like an eternity before finally finding the courage to flee from the haunted place. And little did they know, this would only be the beginning of a series of strange and sinister events that would unfold in the decades to come. This entity was like a nightmare come to life, a tall, dark figure floating ominously behind the railings of Highgate Cemetery. Its face, the most terrifying thing, contorted in horror and malice. Another sighting happened by a man and his dog, and this strange entity would later become known as the Highgate Vampire, and many more sightings were soon to follow. The story quickly spread around town, more rumors spreading each day about this mysterious creature residing in the cemetery walls. People began speaking of their own stories, tales that had been whispered for years among friends and family alike. But now, they were all out in the open, and no one could deny it any longer. The Highgate Vampire had come to life.
An urban legend begins to spread. People report seeing a mysterious tall man inside the cemetery. When he looks at them, the air grows frigid, their muscles freeze.
The late 1960s seemed to be a time of fear because stories began to circulate more and more about this dark figure with glowing eyes that glided and moved seamlessly through the cemetery. However, there were variations in descriptions. Some say it wore a hat, others say it was pale white, and there was just a lot of variety. Soon enough, it was in the newspaper and local media and talking about vampire panic, something which had been occurring on both sides of the Atlantic for some time. Now, people were becoming more scientifically minded at this point and much less superstitious, so things did begin to die down as logic and rational reasoning kind of came into play. But there were some people that decided to take matters into their own hands and go hunting for this supposed legend. In fact, 1967 in particular was very interesting, where a lot of fear and widespread fascination with vampires kind of erupted within London. Beside the sightings I've already spoken about, 2 adolescent girls walking near Swains Lane had an encounter that was entirely out of the ordinary. As they too passed Highgate Cemetery's North Gate, one of them spotted what appeared to be a vampire-like demonic creature rising from the grave. Now, terrified, the girls ran for their lives without looking back or bothering to tell anybody about what they'd seen until news of the Highgate vampire was already spreading across media outlets. Another witness reported something cold and clinging touching her hand one night, which left marks behind when she woke up in the morning. Unfortunately, things only got worse for Highgate as dead animals began showing up in the cemetery. David Ferrant, one of the protagonists in this mystery, I guess you could say, even he had his doubts. I mean, he suspected it could be something else entirely, perhaps a real living vampire.
I suddenly saw a tall figure standing just inside the top gate of Highgate Cemetery.
Apart from the tall man in a hat that multiple people had reported seeing, other strange figures also made appearances, such as a woman in white and even a bicyclist. A ghost cyclist, huh? Now, despite all these sightings, nobody was able to ever definitively prove that Highgate was haunted by a vampire or any kind of supernatural entity. But one winter night in December of 1969, a David Ferrant, a young Wicca enthusiast and member of the British Occult Society, decided it was up to him to investigate the reports of strange sightings at Highgate Cemetery. He set up camp in the graveyard that night, and soon enough, he got what he had come for: a tall, dark figure with piercing, hypnotic eyes and an icy chill in the air around him. It seemed like this was the same entity that had been reported throughout the London cemetery for years now. From then on, Ferrant would become one of 2 most famous figures associated with the Highgate vampire, along with Bishop Sean Manchester. Their antics over the next few years sparked a feud between them, which still continues, or at least did, until Ferrant died back in 2019. The Hampstead and Highgate Express, the local newspaper in Highgate, had taken an interest in the strange sightings around the cemetery. People had reported and talked about seeing Satanists performing black magic rituals and even animal sacrifices there.
There were a group of practicing Satanists who were using Highgate Cemetery in the late 60s. Yeah, that is definitely true. I'm not talking about theatrical Satanists. I'm talking about genuine people that are going inside and performing satanic rituals.
The town was now abuzz with speculation about these unusual and peculiar activities. It seemed like something truly sinister was afoot. In fact, an article was published on March 6, 1970 by the Ham and High about foxes being found drained of blood and their throats cut. While completely strange and out of place, there didn't appear to be a direct correlation, but they were lumped together just because of how strange they were. Possibly the work of satanic cults performing animal blood sacrifices. Now, because all of this had gotten to such a level of public knowledge and it was so attention-grabbing, all these things caught the eye of Sean Manchester, a very interesting fellow to say the least, who claimed to be a bishop in this obscure church. Now, not only did he claim to be a bishop, according to Manchester, but he was also a vampire hunter. And in February of 1970, he gave an interview to the Hampstead and Highgate Express in which he described a very strange demonic figure. Now, according to him, the figure in question at Highgate Cemetery was a king vampire, an undead nobleman from 15th century Romania, who had apparently been deep in the occult and regularly practiced black magic. But not just anywhere in Romania. Wallachia, Romania, the same place that was home to the most infamous vampire to ever existed, Dracula himself, or as many knew him in historical terms, Vlad the Impaler. Or maybe my facts are wrong there. Somebody double check me there. Anyway, somewhere along the way, he traveled to England and would die and be buried in what would become Highgate. Manchester went on to tell the paper that the vampire had actually been revived and brought back into this mortal plane by blood sacrifices and rituals that would allow this thing to come into this realm. Now, this was just the beginning of the legend, of course, or so it said, because on March 1970, David Ferrant and Sean Manchester were both interviewed by the ITV News about reported sightings of this particular vampire, the one of Highgate. Now, Manchester told tales of the so-called king vampire, which had been prowling the area, and announced his intentions to lead a vampire hunt to end this whole charade once and for all. And with this proclamation, people began to speculate even more about how ridiculous this whole thing was and that there really was mysterious creatures lurking in the shadows of Highgate. And it wasn't just teenagers wanting to be cool and killing animals. But little did they know what would come next. People gathered in the cemetery for the vampire hunt, an eerie scene that could have been straight out of a horror movie. The spectacle, I'm sure, was amazing. I mean, hundreds of excited people clambered over the walls and gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural creature they sought after. Alas, their search proved fruitless. No vampires were found. Imagine that. But some participants did report seeing a mysterious dark figure lurking among the tombs and monuments in the graveyard. Despite their lack of success, it was still an unforgettable experience for many. But the legend doesn't stop there. The Highgate vampire legend was a mystery that intrigued these two men, Ferrant and Manchester. They were determined to uncover the truth of what truly lurked in Highgate Cemetery, so they continued their investigations. And in 1970, Ferrant had a brush with the law when he was caught near the cemetery carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. Now, interesting about this detail is I was actually finding conflicting information. One source said that he apparently tried to exhume a body in 1974 and was arrested, while another said it was 1970, so we'll go with 1970. Now, rumors began to swirl about David Ferrant and his intentions. People said he was going to sacrifice a cat in the presence of two naked virgins. When asked about it, Ferrant himself told newspapers that blood must be spilled, but the cat will be anesthetized. His opponent, Sean Manchester, took this as an attack on him personally and declared that he was solely relying on divine power to defeat Ferrant, while Ferrant was relying solely on the power of the Dark Lord Satan. Then one day, when a local man's pet disappeared shortly after this whole escapade, everybody assumed the worst, that Ferrant had been the one who had sacrificed it. And as you can imagine, PETA wasn't around then, and animal lovers combined who had previously found amusement in these antics at the time because no cats were getting hurt, they now turned on Ferrant. In response, he then sued multiple news networks for making him look like some sort of deranged animal killer, and he actually won the lawsuit. But it doesn't end there, folks. Don Ecker claims that Ferrand also made a voodoo doll of the RSPCA inspector and anybody else who had called for his arrest in the angry mob mentality, sticking heads full of pins to get revenge. Now, whether or not he did make a puppet of Manchester is unknown, but certainly the evidence was enough to prove libel, and it seemed that Ferrand might have been more powerful than people thought. A wizard, perhaps, but not just any wizard. It's unclear if he was just a magic practitioner or if he really dove into the dark arts of the occult, blood sacrifices with humans and animals, summoning demons, making deals with dark spirits. To that degree, we won't know for sure. But despite this growing rivalry between the two men, they both wrote books about their experiences over the years. In 1985, Manchester published his own book entitled The Highgate Vampire, where he claimed to have hunted down and killed the creature for 13 more years after Ferrand's arrest. His proof? Supposedly, he has photos of ashes from burning wood that seem to show evidence of ungodly beings being sent back to hell. As you can imagine, as far as I saw, there were no photos released to the public of that. Now, was there really ever a vampire in the Highgate Cemetery? We can only guess at the truth, but it's sure to remain one of London's greatest mysteries. It was a dark and stormy night in the Serbian village of what is now Kisiova. A young man by the name of Peter Blagojevich had died in 1725, and his passing had left the inhabitants of the village he was in with a sense of fear and unease. But why? Well, little did they know that his passing would soon cause their worries to become much, much worse. Within 8 days of Peter Blagojevich's death, 9 people would suddenly perish. On their deathbeds, they would complain about exhaustion and illness, and they all felt like they had been throttled by some invisible, unseen supernatural force. Now you have to remember that at this time in Western and Eastern Europe, superstitions were at an all-time high. And in fact, many do believe now that the same entity had also taken Peter Blagojevich. And it soon became apparent that the only person who could be responsible for these sudden 9 people passing was that of Peter himself. But how? He died. Well, the villagers' suspicions were further confirmed when Peter's own wife had reported that he had apparently come back to visit after dying, asking for his openak. Now, if you don't know, openak is basically the traditional servant footwear that many people wore in this day and age. This was supposedly confirming that he had in fact returned from the dead as some sort of undead creature. And as other local legends describe it, it's said that Peter Blagojevich had come back to his house demanding food from his son, and when his son supposedly refused, he had brutally murdered him, drinking his blood in the process. Faced with this terrifying prospect, the villagers and everybody around had no other choice but to disinter Blagojevich's body and examine it for signs of him truly acting out beyond the grave. But it's what they found when they exhumed his body that truly terrified them. The inhabitants of Kisieva were terrified. They had heard these kinds of stories before, but most of them just assumed it was superstition, and now a real-life version of this was terrorizing their community, and they were desperate to put an end to this once and for all. And as you know, desperate times calls for desperate measures, and so the villagers demanded that the Caporal Provisor Frumbold, along with a local priest, should present at the procedure. Now, Frumbold tried to convince them that permission from the Austrian authorities in Belgrade should be sought first, but the locals were adamant. Time was of the essence, and they feared that by the time permission came through, it would already be too late. Now, Frumbold found himself in a difficult situation. He could either deny their plea and leave them to fend for themselves, or he could take a chance and grant them permission to go ahead with the procedure. Now, I'm sure at this point you're scratching your head screaming, what's going on? We'll get to that in a second. Now, ultimately, Fear of potential death and worse won out, and Frumbald reluctantly gave in to the villagers' demands. With all preparations made, the community had finally had hope that this would be put to rest once and for all. And so, the hunt began. The villagers of Velikogradište were in a state of panic. Legends had long whispered of something living amongst them in the shadows. And now there was news that this body had been discovered. Along with the local priest, the village's mayor was called to examine the corpse. Upon seeing it, he too was amazed by the horror that lay there right only feet away from them. And here is where the twist comes in. They weren't dealing with the Walking Dead. They weren't dealing with some man that had just casually gotten up from the grave and decided to waltz around and kill people. No. This was far worse. For you see, when they had exhumed his grave and actually saw Peter's corpse, what they saw were all signs and characteristics that he had never died. Undecayed flesh, hair and beard growth, new skin and fingernails replacing those that had peeled away, and the worst of all, blood around his mouth. This filled the villagers with rage and fear, and so the only way they knew how to solve this problem was to take a stake and to pound it and drive it right into the heart of what they assumed was a real-life living vampire. Now the legend goes that as this was done, fresh blood began to pour out from the wound, from the ears, and from the mouth of this supposed corpse. And after that was done, they took the body, or what was left of it, and burned the rest, hoping to end this nightmare for good. The authorities apparently did not consider it necessary to take any measures regarding the incident. Now, long ago in Eastern Europe, a mysterious event occurred that would be documented and spread throughout the world. Because in 1725, reported by what is now known as Die Wiener Zeitung, it told of strange occurrences surrounding a vampire case, in particular Peter's. It was said that Austrian officials had witnessed peculiar phenomena which is now known to be associated with the decomposition of a body. Now this story that I just told you, along with a very similar one from Arnold Paoli in 1726 to 1732, were widely translated and read all throughout Germany, France, and England. And this created what became known as the vampire craze during the 18th century. And it was through these cases and stories that vampire beliefs became extremely prominent in popular culture, and the fear of vampires would spread like wildfire. It may have been fear that fueled it, but it was also a fascination with the unknown, something that will continue to captivate people for centuries to come. I mean, who knows? Maybe there really are creatures of the night. Around the same time as Peter Blachowicz, in the village of Medvegia, there lived a Serbian peasant named Arnold Paoli. He had served in the Austrian army against the Ottoman forces that controlled Turkish Serbia and returned home to marry and start life as a farmer. But little did anyone know that he had an even darker past. He had been attacked by a vampire during a service, and after killing said vampire, Paoli claimed to have eaten some of its grave dirt and bathed in its blood. Now, when Paoli died after an unfortunate accident, villagers, just like Peter, began dropping off and dying like that, of what they all assumed to be some mysterious supernatural plague. And on the 40th day after his burial, they exhumed his body and found, just like Peter, that it had not been stricken with rot quite yet. Now, during this era, when you die and you're just being tossed in a wooden casket or just being tossed in the ground with dirt over you, and you're at day 40, you should definitely have rot. Now, as they looked down and saw that Arnold had not even had any signs of decay, immediately, panic-stricken, they took a stake and pounded it and pounded it and pounded it and drove it right through his heart and then decapitated him to keep him from resurrecting. Paoli was believed to have become a vampire himself in response to the vampire hysteria that had now been plaguing Eastern and Western Europe in this short time. The Austrian authorities sent field surgeon Johannes Fluckinger in to investigate, and he discovered that another man named Milo had somehow become a vampire, a servant of the dead, after eating a piece of tainted beef by Paoli's body. Fluckinger and the villagers destroyed Milo and all of his victims in the usual way. Now, Fluckinger's report spread like wildfire across Europe, leading to an increased fascination and fear with vampires and their dark origins. Just like the story of Arnold Paoli. To this day, he is remembered as one of the earliest real-life influences on modern-day fictional vampire tales. But to truly understand modern-day fictional vampire tales, we needed to go back to one of the original vampire cases. Going back to the 17th century, there lived a man named Yuri Grendo in a small Istrian village called Gringa. Now, not much is known about Grendo's life, but some sources say he was quite a terrible guy. Now, one fateful day, Grendo passed away and was buried in the local cemetery by Father Giorgio. However, soon after his burial, strange things began to happen. People around the village began reporting sightings of Grandio wandering around the village and knocking on doors and begging for food, or even worse. Needless to say, this spooked out the locals, and stories spread far and wide about what had happened after his death. The villagers were left wondering if their beloved friend had somehow come back to haunt them, or if something else was afoot. It was said that in the countryside of the Istrian Peninsula, there dwelled a type of vampire known as a strigon. It was believed that these blood-sucking beings were once sorcerers who fed on the blood of children while they were still alive. And upon their death, they became undead, continuing to roam the villages around midnight, seeking their next victim. Now, according to Johann Weikert von Vavasor, a 17th century natural historian, it was said that when one heard a knock on their door late at night, within days, someone from their household would fall ill and eventually die. This story is similar to that of Yore Grando, whose legend could have possibly been inspired by stories of the Strigon. The villagers believed that if anybody died during the period when the Strigon was sighted, that they had been taken and eaten by this mysterious creature. The villagers were so terrified of the Strigon that they even thought it had the ability to silently creep into their beds to sleep with their women. It was said that this creature had a taste for widows in particular, especially if they were young and beautiful. Now, natural historian Vavasor wrote about these beliefs and fears in his work, which has been passed down through generation ever since. Everyone at that time believed in the dark power of these mysterious creatures known as the Strigon. Tales of its malevolent activities spread far and wide, so it's really no surprise when the villagers around Yuri Grando's village were filled with fear. And for 16 long years, they had suffered at his hands, and something needed to be done. And so, Miho Radati, mayor of the village, gathered a group of brave young men, 9 actually, together for one purpose: to hunt down Yuri Grando and put an end to his reign of terror. Now, this was no easy task. And so the mayor gathered up these 9 young men and made their way to the local cemetery, intent on vanquishing this so-called vampire. When they opened Grando's grave, they were horrified to discover that his body was still intact, a sign of vampirism. Fearful of their lives, the men fled in terror, but eventually mustered up the courage to go back and face this undead monster. Led by the mayor, they attempted to rid themselves of this creature from beyond the grave by invoking the name of Jesus Christ. But it did not seem to work. They were frustrated and afraid, yet despite these fears, something had to be done. Or else Grando might truly come back from death's door eternally. So the men stood their ground and continued on in their mission, determined to see it through no matter what. And that's when something special happened. They found the courage within themselves to truly believe in a higher power, and with one last plea for help, a miraculous thing occurred. Or I guess you can call it a miracle. One of them pulled out a wooden stake and attempted to pierce the creature's stomach, but it did not work. As hope looked lost, one version of the story is that Stephen Malachi stepped forward armed with an axe, and with one mighty stroke, he beheaded Grando, and blood spilled from his neck, and a loud cry echoed through the graveyard. Satisfied with their mission that it was complete, the men quickly filled in Grando's grave so no trace of what happened could possibly remain. And thus ended Yore Grando's reign of terror over the villages for good. Now, whether it was merely a legend or based on truth, one thing is certain: this creature remains an elusive and mysterious figure in Istrian lore. Easter of 1976, in the quaint and picturesque village of Monin, there was a weekend that would be forever etched into the memories of two young girls, June and Vicky Melling. Now, the Melling family was currently on holiday, eagerly exploring the enchanting Monin woods, but little did they know that their perfect retreat would take a nightmarish turn that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the sun cast its golden rays on the ancient 13th century church, June and Vicky found themselves face to face with something beyond their wildest imaginations. Completely terror-stricken, the girls would flee to their father, Don Melling, who was now consumed by a burning rage at the sight of his daughter's distress. With every fiber of his being, Don Melling was convinced that a local magician known as Tony Doc Shields was somehow responsible for this terrifying event that had completely shaken his daughters. Of course, Shields vehemently denied any involvement in the matter, but the air of mystery and suspicion surrounding the incident only grew thicker. Word began to spread, and another brave soul came forward with her own harrowing tale. A woman by the name of Jane Greenwood, a young girl on holiday with her sister and mother, penned a letter to the Falmouth Packet recounting her spine-chilling encounter. She described how on a fateful Sunday morning she stumbled upon the nightmarish sight before her. As Jane's own heart could barely handle it and pounding in her chest, her mind reeling from the horrific sight, she too fled in terror. But it wouldn't stop there, folks, because now in the summer of 1976, on the outskirts of the mystical Monin Woods, another chilling encounter unfolded that would leave two innocent 14-year-old girls, Sally Chapman and Barbara Perry, shaken to their very cores. The sun had long since disappeared beyond the horizon, casting the woods in a shroud of darkness, illuminated only by the silvery glow of the moon. As Sally and Barbara set up camp, they eagerly anticipated the adventure that awaited them. With nightfall enveloping the forest, the girls gathered round their tent, boiling a pot of tea to warm their spirits. And the crackle of the fire and the soothing melody of the woods had lulled them into this false sense of security. And suddenly, the calm of the night now ruined. Their hearts raced as they cautiously scanned the shadowy forest, and their eyes settling on a horrific sight. In fact, Sally's voice would tremble as she recounted this experience. She believed it was someone just trying to play a cruel joke, and they tried to nervously laugh it off. But in the blink of an eye, something would happen that would defy all doubt. As the two girls huddled together in terror, what lay before them vanished, and now their lives would never be the same, leaving an everlasting imprint of fear and dread in the hearts of Sally Chapman and Barbara Perry. Fast forward to the year of 1988, and a young boy aptly named Gavin witnessed something beyond his wildest nightmares. In fact, this boy's sighting was so significant because it would be documented. And what Gavin and all the previous eyewitnesses saw will disturb you. Here's what it was. June and Vicky both swear by what they saw that day on Easter of 1976, because above that 13th century church was what they would describe as a monstrous, feathery Birdman hovering ominously above the weathered spires, they described. Even Jane Greenwood saw something very similar in the same area. Her sighting, she described it like a nightmarish creature perched high in the trees with a almost human-like posture. Its legs, however, were bent backwards like that of a bird. After this being had sensed Jane's presence, it locked onto her, and it immediately leapt from its perch, soaring effortlessly through the trees. Even Sally and Barbara saw this same thing, with every detail adding up to what the other eyewitnesses had said. They both saw what they would describe as the Owlman, only 60 feet away in the woods watching them. Sally's voice trembled as she recounted it, that it was like this monstrous owl with red eyes, pointed ears, and large wings, slowly and carefully observing them, much in the same way that a lion would observe its prey. This is the very thing that they assumed was someone in a costume or was someone just trying to play a cruel joke. And this is when, after some time, this being or entity took off into the air with a powerful gust of wind that blew back at Sally and Barbara, letting them know that there really was something there, and then it vanished. Even Gavin's sighting would follow the same pattern. He and his girlfriend at the time, Sally, both saw the same thing. Something they would say is around 5 feet tall, glowing red eyes, and bird-like feet. In his book, The Owlman and the Others, Jonathan Downes delves into the chilling phenomenon that has captivated and terrified the residents of Cornwall for decades now. Among the numerous eyewitness accounts and spine-tingling encounters, one particular story does stand out, and that is the first-hand experience of a young boy named Gavin. In a rare and candid interview, Gavin opened up to John about the horrifying experience that left him forever changed, providing a detailed account of the day he came face to face with the creature. Also in Cornwall, England, lived a man by the name of Tony Doc Shields. Known for his interest in the arcane, he was a practitioner of ritualistic magic, dabbling in ancient arts that only few dare to explore. His extensive knowledge of occult practices earned him a reputation within the close-knit community, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. His life was filled with mysteries and secrets, but it was his alleged connection to the Owlman of Cornwall that would later define his legacy. As you guys know now, that in the summer of 76, there were a host of strange sightings reported in the village of Monin. Whispers of a creature half man, half owl, part demon, haunting the woods near the ancient Monin church. Eyewitnesses would continue to describe the Owlman as this strange feathered humanoid with glowing red eyes and sending chills down the spines of all the villagers it was seen by. And Tony Doc Shields, a known investigator of the unexplained at the time, took a keen interest into these sightings. Armed with his background in the occult, he delved into the case, speaking to witnesses, collecting evidence, and trying to discern the truth behind the elusive Owlman. As he continued his investigations, whispers in the community began to suggest that the Owlman was not just a random creature, but perhaps a product of his ritualistic magic. These suspicions only grew more and more, as some believed that his arcane practices had brought the cryptid into existence, either by summoning it from another plane or through a dark transformation. Tony Shields, however, never confirmed nor denied his involvement, and he has since moved to Ireland. In 2021, a ghost hunter from Falmouth made claims that he not only had an encounter of his very own, but an actual reason or suspicion for the supposed Owlman's existence in this very location. A Mark Davis, who was in the graveyard of the church at the time with his friend Chris Power from Manchester, said this: "There's ley lines which are under the ground near the church, and they give off paranormal activity. There was a hissing in the trees and you could hear flapping. I heard it go right over my head and I was shocked. That's when I saw the figure, and it had horns on its head. It was mad. On the meter I had, which picks up electric magnetic energy that we use to detect ghosts, I was getting conscious replies to my questions through it. That's telling me there's a demonic energy and it wasn't safe. My mate got attacked, he had scratches on his arm, his camera broke too. He didn't see anything, he just felt this surge of energy. He didn't realize till about half an hour later when he felt some burning. It's not a place I would advise anyone to go there alone, let's put it that way. The 13th century church, whose eerie atmosphere and shadowy past have forever been entwined with the mystifying sightings of the Owlman. Its weathered stone walls and Gothic architecture bear silent witness to centuries of dark history, where whispers of black magic and devilish rituals echo through the hallowed halls. The villagers, though skeptical of these tales, cannot deny the inexplicable terror that seems to emanate from around the area, fueling the legend of the Owlman and casting an ominous shadow over the sacred grounds. Beneath the very foundations of the church, it is believed that ley lines, invisible channels of energy that kind of crisscross the earth, converge, creating a potent nexus of paranormal activity. These ley lines, steeped in lore and legend, are said to be the life force of the planet, a conduit for ancient power that can be harnessed by those who dare to tap into its dark secrets. It is this hidden energy that many speculate has given rise to the terrifying Owlman sightings, drawing the creature to the church like a moth to the flame, or perhaps even birthing it from the very depths of the earth itself. As the sun sets over the hauntingly beautiful Monon Woods, casting the church and its surroundings into twilight, the lines between reality and myth begin to blur. The power of the ley lines beneath the church pulses like a heartbeat, awakening the dark recesses of the imagination and causing the air to crackle with supernatural energy. It is here, in this timeless sacred space, that the Owlman is said to come alive, a chilling manifestation of the darkness. Some believe that the church's shadowy past, intertwined with tales of black magic and occult practices, has imbued the land with a malevolent energy, attracting the Owlman to its hallowed grounds. Others speculate that the convergence of ley lines beneath the church has opened a portal to another realm, allowing this terrifying creature to slip through the veil and haunt the nightmare of those who witness its monstrous form. All, of course, without the help of Tony Doc Shields. Now, various theories have been proposed to explain the Owlman sightings, including hoaxes, misidentifications of known animals, supernatural or paranormal explanations, and unknown or undiscovered species. To date, no definitive evidence has been found to confirm the existence of the Owlman. While thought to be a cryptid, an animal or creature whose existence has not been proven, it is not considered a real animal by mainstream science and is generally regarded as a legend or folklore by most. There is still no scientific evidence to support the existence of this creature, and the various sightings and encounters reported over the years have not yielded any conclusive proof. And while there is a host of skeptical theories, none of those have been proven either. So I ask you, was it Tony Doc Shields, the practitioner of magic, who tore open the veil between dimensions, allowing this entity to emerge and reveal itself? Have the countless eyewitnesses fallen prey to the power of suggestion and misidentification? Or is the entire phenomenon an elaborate fabrication, lacking any solid foundation for the reported sightings? The truth may remain forever shrouded in mystery, leaving us to ponder the enigma of the Owlman and question the depths of darkness that lurk within the human psyche. The mystery of the Cornwall Owlman does remain a mystery. In this next section, I wanted to showcase a phenomenon that's so universal that many people have experienced it and not realized what it was. In fact, it's so commonplace that almost everyone has a story. It's a phenomenon known as synchronicity. When I shot this episode, I didn't know how to package the video properly, and because of that, it didn't perform well. However, the nature of the topic itself is fascinating, and one you'll be asking yourself, have you ever experienced a moment where seemingly unrelated events align meaningfully? Are we living in a matrix simulation? This is a question that has been pondered by scientists, philosophers, and thinkers for centuries. But what if the answer to that question lies not in technology or science, but in the mysterious and powerful force of synchronicity? Synchronicity is the concept of meaningful coincidences, and they've been observed by people all over the world and even studied by some of the greatest minds in history. But what if these seemingly random events and coincidences that we experience are not random, but actual manifestations of a deeper reality? One that is controlled by a higher power or intelligence, or even God. In this video, we will explore the idea that synchronicity is not just a strange phenomenon, but the key to understanding our true reality. Émile Duchamp was born in 1791. Unknown to the family, Émile was destined for greatness. Although initially following in his father's footsteps, serving France as a civil servant, he can never deny his passion for the written word, and in 1812 penned an ode, La Paix Conquise, which caught the eye of Napoleon Bonaparte. And after that, his trajectory was firmly established. He was to become a great poet, collaborating with others to produce both stage comedies and great works of musical art. By far his lasting contribution is the text for Hector Boreal's choral symphony Romeo et Juliet, which is still performed today by symphonies all around the world. However, Émile's life is also notable for a string of bizarre coincidences which trace from his youth all the way through his adult life. As a child, he was sent to a boarding school in Orléans. On one particular occasion, he was treated to a foreign delicacy, British plum pudding, at the time relatively unknown in France. It was a remarkable dish, made all the more notable by the company that Émile found himself with that day. Sitting at Émile's table was a Monsieur de Faucevaux, who had recently returned from England. It seems as though Monsieur de Faucevaux had developed a taste for plum pudding during his travels and was eager for young Émile to try a bite. It was like 1,000 other meals we all have in our youth. Exciting at the time, but the memory was supplanted by countless others. In fact, Émile more or less forgot his meal with Monsieur de Faucevaux until a decade later, when it all came flooding back to him. Now, he was enjoying another meal, this time as an adult at a restaurant on Boulevard Poissonnier in Paris. When trying to decide what he would like to eat, something caught the young man's eye, a plum pudding. Now, immediately the memory of the special treat that he had eaten back in boarding school was rekindled, and it was the only thing in the world that he wanted. So he asked a slice of the delicacy, but was disappointed to learn that the entire dish had only moments before been purchased by another man. He was crestfallen. Seeing the look on his face, the server shouted in the direction of the person who had just bought the plum pudding, "Monsieur de Faucevaux, would you have the goodness to share your plum pudding with this gentleman?" If Émile could hardly believe his ears, he certainly had to believe his eyes. There, in another corner of the restaurant, old and gray, dressed in a colonel's uniform, sat the same man with whom he had first shared plum pudding 10 years ago. It is unclear whether or not Monsieur de Faucevaux recognized Émile, but in any case, he was willing to part with a bit of his plum pudding. It was a striking coincidence, but that is all it is, right? I mean, after all, it is not outside the realm of possibility that Émile would have met the same man twice. Orléans and Paris are only around 70 miles apart. For years, he kept the chance encounter in the back of his mind, nothing more than an amusing anecdote to share with his friends. But years later, he received an invitation to attend a dinner party where a genuine English plum pudding was planned to be offered as part of the meal. The invitation, but enthusiastically, shared the tale of Monsieur de Faucevaux with the lady of the house, joking that if plum pudding was involved, the old man would be there, some way or another, without a doubt. The two laughed at the idea, thinking nothing more of the coincidence. By the day of the party, the jest was forgotten entirely. Now, the day finally came. 10 guests took their places at the dinner table, and the plum pudding was served. Emile, searching for a topic of conversation, once again shared the curious tale of Monsieur de Fauchibou as they ate, much to the delight of the other dinner guests. Everyone was literally mid-bite when the door to the dining room swung open and the house's servant announced the arrival of a visitor. Can you guess who? That's right, Monsieur de Fauchibou. Was Emile hallucinating? Had the host of the party contacted Monsieur de Fauchibou as a practical joke? It was, after all, carnival time, and such pranks would be fitting with the general spirit of the season. The visitor seemed real enough, a look of concern washing over his face as he scoured the crowd, and it looked as though he were searching for someone. At last he came to Emile, forcing the poet to concede, once and for all, that this was the same man who had accompanied Plum Pudding his entire life. There was no doubt that the Monsieur de Fauchibou stood before him in the flesh. Emile was terrified. "My hair stood up on my head," he said, and within moments the decrepit visitor explained that he was at the wrong address. It seems that an old friend who just so happened to reside in the same building had invited Monsieur de Fauchibou to dinner that night. The old man, either being senile or having diminished eyesight, had mixed up the doors of their apartments and wandered into the dinner party unannounced, completely by random chance. The saga of Monsieur de Fauchibou and the Plum Pudding is one of the most famous examples ever documented of synchronicity, the connection of mental and physical events without any clear cause. It notably differs from similar phenomena like extrasensory perception or ESP in several key ways, and notably there is little to no conscious will involved. Now, ESP occurs when people become aware of events displaced by time or space. The participants in synchronicities, on the other hand, are always as surprised by these coincidences as everyone else around them. No one actively wants them. Synchronicities cannot be controlled, and they appear to offer little worthwhile use. While many carry profound personal meanings for observers, synchronicities rarely have any lasting implications. Often as not, they are simply nonsense. What is the lesson of Monsieur de Fauchibou and the Plum Pudding? Well, there is none. Like other synchronicities, it just simply happened. This, of course, may hide greater depth. With synchronicities, one gets the sense that they are perceiving the underlying bedrock of reality. As an analogy, consider islands in the ocean. We see these bits of land popping out above the water as isolated from one another, but they are all a part of the same strata, connecting every landmass across the globe. We only recognize them when they break the surface. Similarly, synchronicities strongly imply that everything is connected, even the most mundane aspects of our lives, by some underlying complex architecture. I mean, we only get the barest hints of this connection when things pop up too blatantly to be ignored, kind of like what many refer to as glitches in the Matrix. Now, when one looks for these things, they appear everywhere. You see your birth date in a string of numbers. After buying a new car, you start seeing that car everywhere. You might rarely look at the clock throughout the day, and whenever you do, it is often the same time. And from staring at this beard so long, you might start seeing this on many other people, randomly. So maybe these things have a significance to you, possibly a string of numbers in succession like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 2, 3, 4, or 3, 4, 5. Modern psychology offers a solution to these reoccurring coincidences. Now, the primary explanation is that these events can be ascribed to something known as frequency illusion or frequency bias. Now, this delusion, skeptics argue, manifests through selective attention and confirmation bias. You simply notice these things because you are looking for them, because your mind has been primed, as it were, rather than anything objectively spooky going on. Now, this explanation fails entirely when objectivity creeps into the picture, like in the case of Monsieur de Fauchibou and the Plum Pudding. Now, if the events were relayed accurately, no one can deny that the old man was physically there in each instance, and the synchronicity was not an artifact of mental processes. Another good example comes from America, shortly after World War II. A young girl remembered her father taking her to a soda shop where, much to his delight, an old friend from the war walked through the door. The father was disappointed when he realized that the man was not his friend and that he only bore a strong resemblance. However, moments later, his friend arrived as if the entire event had been planned by some unseen stage director. Frequency bias cannot explain these examples. Frequency bias only works when the synchronicity is subjective, when a coincidence is perceived by an individual, but remains impossible to verify. Now, on the contrary, we have plenty of examples where synchronicities unfold outside of anyone's control, where it seems almost as if the universe is following some sort of invisible script. Only every so often we are granted the privilege of a glimpse into the inner workings of reality. Camille Flammarion, who chronicled the saga of the Monsieur de Fauchibou and the plum pudding, noted another astounding synchronicity. While he was writing a chapter on the subject of windy weather, he was astounded and dismayed to find his papers whisked away by a sudden gust that carried the chapter off in a miniature whirlwind beyond hope of recovery. Several days later, the despondent Flammarion was contacted by his publisher, who handed over the entire chapter intact. The whirlwind had carried it to the feet of one of the publisher's employees, who assumed that he had dropped them during his errands. Other examples litter history books. American founding fathers Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both passed away on July 4th, 1826, Independence Day, which might not exist without their efforts. They died within hours of one another. And the first person to die during the construction of Nevada's Hoover Dam was J.G. Tierney in 1922. 14 years after, his son Patrick was the last person to die in its construction. What a damn coincidence. Haha, just kidding. In 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi survived the bombing of Hiroshima, only to flee to Nagasaki, where he witnessed the second atomic bomb detonation. Now, he is recognized as the only person to have survived both blasts. Now, in 1970, actor Anthony Hopkins looked high and low for The Girl from Petrovka to prepare for a film adaptation of the book, and he at last found a copy signed by the author completely by chance. Someone had left it behind in a London tube station where he had just so happened to be. Now, these wild coincidences have continued into recent years. In 2001, a 10-year-old girl named Laura Buxton released a red balloon near Marlborough, England. On the side, she had written, "Please return to Laura Buxton," complete with her address. Now check this out, it gets crazy. Now, it was found 140 miles south by another 10-year-old girl also named Laura Buxton. Both girls looked and dressed similarly and had identical pets. In fact, both Lauras brought their guinea pigs when they met, completely unplanned. Around 2010, Stephen Lee and his future wife Helen had just become engaged when they discovered something shocking in his late father's old photographs. Stephen's father and Helen's mother had almost gotten married themselves in the 1960s in Korea. They had called the wedding off when their parents did not approve, unfortunately. Now, despite the vanishingly low odds of being struck by a meteorite, in 2011, one struck the household of a French family with the appropriate last name. Comet. Yes, science nerds, I know that a meteorite isn't a comet, but come on. Now, Dutch cyclist Martin de Jonge was scheduled twice to fly on Malaysia Airlines in 2014, only to bump his tickets at the last minute. In both instances, he avoided tragedy, as one flight was shot down over Ukraine, while the other famously disappeared above the Indian Ocean. And in 1988, a Shu Weifeng of Jiangsu province saved a boy from drowning, one of 3 others he would save over the course of his life near the river. The latest person Shu saved was an 8-year-old boy who was found thrashing in the river on August 3rd, 2018. It turned out to be the son of the man he had saved 30 years ago. I mean, apparently this family does not take swimming lessons. Now, another set of synchronicities comes from my scriptwriter, Josh Cutchin, who had this to share. Now, some of you won't believe what I'm about to say, and that's fine. I know what happened, and that's all I need to know. I'll try to relay it as best as I can, as quickly as I can, as best as I can remember. I was coming back from a gig in Austin sometime in around 2008. The entire time I had been in Texas. I had been obsessing over a relationship that I was in back in Georgia, which was starting to show the first signs of falling apart. I have diagnosed OCD, so when I latch onto something, I tend to have a hard time letting it go. A little background on my then girlfriend. She was a graduate of the Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, where she had obtained a degree in oboe performance. You'll see why this is important in a few moments. Her first name was Whitney, and her last name was one that could have easily been used as a girl's first name. For the sake of anonymity, let's call her last name Cameron. So Whitney Cameron. So I'm sitting in my plane and we're all boarding. I'm stressed over my relationship and trying to take my mind off it by doing a crossword puzzle. Yeah, I know. Sounds like an old man thing. But within the space of a minute, 3 incredible things happen, none of which I can explain today. If it had been just one thing, it would have been a coincidence, but 3 defies logic for me. I am shocked as I complete the crossword answer for a woodwind instrument. The answer is oboe. Okay, not a huge synchronicity. But then the guy in front of me drops his ticket. I see it underneath his seat and pick it up. The final destination is Cincinnati. To top it all off, he stands up, turns around, and props his elbows on the seat. He asks if he can have his ticket back, please. I hesitate only because I see the 2 tattoos on his forearms, and I kid you not, they read Whitney on his right arm and Cameron on his left. I presumed they were the names of his children. My jaw was on the floor. I handed the ticket back to him, and in that moment, I knew that everything would be okay. Not that the relationship would survive, it did not, but I knew that there was a bigger plan for me. Now, the next biggest synchronicity I ever experienced happened in late 2020. I have twin boys, and again, here's my OCD cropping up. I often worry about how much software I need to upload into their little brains. There are 1,000 things I want to teach them, and I sometimes have no idea where to start. Now, for whatever reason, my OCD had seized upon Aesop's fables that day. Where did I learn them? I have to teach the boys. Maybe I should pick up a copy. I planned on buying one the first chance I got. The only problem was that I was taking them for a walk in their stroller. So the entire time home, I kept repeating to myself, Aesop's fables, Aesop's fables, Aesop's fables. I get home and I have a missed call from my mother. She and Dad are on vacation at the beach, so I get the boys situated and call back right away. Now, I kid you not, the first thing out of her mouth is, "Hey, we're at the bookshop that we love at the beach, and I picked up something for the boys." It's an illustrated collection of Aesop's fables. Again, my jaw hits the floor. I don't normally speak about Aesop's fables. It isn't something I have talked about with my parents in the past 20 years. Yet here, on this day that my OCD fixated on Aesop's fables, my mother picked up a copy for my children, exactly what I was planning to do the moment that I hung up the phone. What is going on here? Everything from divine intervention to chaos theory has been rolled out over the centuries to explain synchronicities. The contemporary New Age movement has seized up synchronicities as messages from the cosmos, which offer confirmation that one is traveling the correct path that the universe has set out for them. Others suspect that when we see synchronicities, we are tapping into the archetypal nature of reality, and that we may be coming face to face with some sort of unseen trickster force orchestrating everything. Either a literal entity, God, an epiphenomenon of interpersonal interaction, or our own shadow selves, the parts of our psyches which we deny and refuse to integrate. Still, others think that synchronicities are simply the visible manifestation of phenomena we yet do not understand, like precognition, or even more mind-bendingly, retrocausality. Now, retrocausality is the idea that future events actually reach back and influence what happens in the past. It's a trippy concept, but might hold true. I mean, if time is indeed non-linear, as many physicists suspect, Anyone interested in this idea should pick up a copy of Eric Wargo's Time Loops, Precognition, Retrocausation, and the Unconscious, the most comprehensive examination of this possibility to date. But before anyone tried to understand synchronicities, the first matter of business was to demonstrate that they actually existed at all. Now, the first person to actively investigate synchronicities was biologist Paul Kammerer, who, in the early 20th century, tried to strip them of their subjective qualities and instead focus only on their objective nature. Kammerer fastidiously kept a log of his own synchronicities beginning at the age of 20, amassing so many examples that he published them as a book, The Law of the Series, in 1919. Now, a reading of the book clearly suggests that Kammerer is not an outlier. All of us experience these coincidences throughout our lives, regardless of whether or not we consciously recall them or ascribe any deeper meaning to them. Now, he concluded that the recurrence of identical or similar data in contiguous areas of space or time is a simple empirical fact which has to be accepted and which cannot be explained by coincidence, or rather which make coincidence rule to such an extent that the concept of coincidence itself is negated. In other words, while nothing in the universe ever has a 0% chance of happening, there's always some infinitesimal possibility, no matter how small, when you have multiple incidences where statistically impossible events collapse one on top of another. It implies a greater, more mysterious force at work. Some call it God, some call it the powers of the universe. While Kammerer may have been the first to examine them, he is not the most prominent researcher of synchronicities. That honor goes to none other than Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology. Now, despite his former training, Jung had a long-standing interest in mysticism and the supernatural, experiencing precognition, attending seances, and seeing, for lack of a better term, could be called ghosts. He even wrote an essay turned into a small book on flying saucers. Now, in many regards, Jung's paranormal interest came to a head in his study of synchronicity, which he deemed a causal connecting principle. Jung intuited that a deeper holistic interpretation of reality allowed human nature and the external world to coexist and influence one another, a relationship hinted at in synchronicities. In fact, it was Jung himself who coined the term synchronicity, an idea birthed out of a dinner conversation that he held with Albert Einstein. Jung eventually wrote his own book on the topic, where he explored the possibility that synchronicities do represent an interaction between the physical world and our unconscious minds. He concluded that we must assume coincidences are simply lucky hits, so as long as proof is lacking that their incidence exceeds the limits of probability. However, we should remain open to the possibility that events in general are related to one another, on the one hand as causal chains, and on the other hand by a kind of meaningful cross-connection. In his work, Jung cited not only examples from the historical record, but also ones that he had personally experienced. Some of these perfectly embody the nonsensical nature found in synchronicities. For example, he wrote this: "To mention but one example out of many, I noted the following on April 1st, 1949. Today is Friday. We have fish for lunch. Somebody happens to mention the custom of making an April fish of someone, the French equivalent of April Fools. Now, that same morning, I made a note of an inscription which read, in Latin, 'It is man from the middle, fish from the bottom.' In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for months, showed me some extremely impressive pictures of fish, which she had painted in the meantime. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with fish-like sea monsters on it. On that morning of April 2nd, another patient whom I had not seen for many years told me a dream in which she stood on the shore of a lake and saw a large fish that swam straight towards her and landed at her feet. I was at this time engaged on a study of the fish symbol and history. Only one of the persons mentioned here knew anything about it. As a pendant to what I've said above, I should like to mention that I wrote these lines sitting by the lake. Just as I had finished this sentence, I walked over to the seawall and there lay a dead fish about a foot long, apparently uninjured. No fish had been there the previous evening. Presumably it had been pulled out of the water by a bird of prey or a cat. The fish was the 7th in the series. Now, one of the most famous synchronicities Jung experienced involved one of his patients. He was treating a young woman when, at a critical point in their session, she mentioned a dream where she received a golden scarab, a classic example of the birth symbol, hitting at her unconscious desire for self-transformation or rebirth. Jung sat back, listening to her retell her dream. He then noticed a gentle tapping at the window behind him. Now turning, Jung saw an insect battering itself against the glass. He gets up, opens the window, and caught it as it flew in. Jung now held in his hand a rose chafer scarab beetle, which for some reason, contrary to its habits, had sought the darkened recesses of their room. Jung said, "I must admit that nothing like it ever happened to me before or since, and that the dream of the patient has remained unique in my experience." Jung's interaction with the scarab hints at other incidents where animals have become message bearers for synchronicities. Like in June of 1994, local beekeeper Margaret Bell passed away in Ludlow, Shropshire. During her funeral, a swarm of bees congregated on the corner of a Bell Lane building, almost as if to pay their last respects. In November of 1974, Noel McCabe was listening to a Frankie Lane record in his Derby, England home. The song he was playing was The Cry of the Wild Goose. According to the local newspaper, a Canada goose crashed through his bedroom window midway through the song. In yet another example, a photo in South Africa's Daily News from October 19, 1926, showed a picture of a fish bearing a unique scale pattern that strongly resembled the Union Jack flag. As it just so happens, the country was embroiled in a national debate about the design of a new South African flag and the role that the Union Jack would play in its design. Now, according to the man who submitted the photo, a Mr. W. Thompson of Durban, the fish had been recently caught in the Indian Ocean. One specific variety of synchronicity is known as the library angel. Now, in these cases, an individual is searching for a specific reference, usually a book in a library, when the item itself finds them rather than vice versa. Maybe we really are in a matrix, guys. I mean, books fall off the shelves or appear on a table nearby, but this is strange. But this is what happened to author Colin Wilson when researching his 1971 book, The Occult. Wilson said that, on one occasion when I was searching for a piece of information, a book actually fell off the shelf and fell open at the right page. Now, how the heck does that happen? In another instance, covered in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, a physicist held in a Soviet prison found himself passing the hours obsessing over a complex technical problem, one he knew he could solve if he only had the proper mathematical tables. However, the prison's library only offered Soviet propaganda. Now, the physicist prayed for a miracle until one day, while randomly distributing books to prisoners, a guard handed him a book full of the formula he needed. The prisoner memorized the tables before the book was confiscated. Now, in 1972, a Dame Rebecca West was scouring a library for a specific episode that occurred during the Nuremberg trials, but could not locate it. She was at her wit's end when something miraculous happened. She wrote this: "I looked up the trials in the library and was horrified to find that they are published in a form almost useless to the researcher. They are abstracts and are cataloged under arbitrary headings. After hours of search, I went along the line of shelves to an assistant librarian and said, 'I can't find it. There's no clue. It may be in any of these volumes.' I put my hand on one of the volumes and took it out and carelessly looked at it. It was not only the right volume, but I had opened it to the right page." Now, another type of synchronicity sees twins, even though separated at birth, leading similar lives. Countless examples exist and are especially common among identical twins. For example, in 1940, identical twins Jim Lewis and Jim Springer were separated at birth and given up for adoption. Now, unknown to them, they grew up only 40 miles apart, raised by different families in Minnesota. Both boys received the same first name, and at school, they each enjoyed math and woodworking, but hated spelling. Both of them had stepbrothers named Larry, and both of them owned dogs named Troy. Now, upon reaching adulthood, they had similar hobbies and interests. Both were chain smokers and both suffered from migraines. Most bizarrely, both brothers married women named Linda. Both Jims divorced their Lindas only to remarry. Their second wives were both named Betty. Now, shared life details might even span across unrelated individuals. Did you know that two men named Brady Feigl are baseball players, one in the major league, the other in the minor league? They learned about each other when they visited the same doctor, Dr. James Andrews, for the same elbow surgery. Here's the kicker. Even though they are unrelated, they look uncannily similar, standing 6'4" with bright red hair, glasses, and even similar facial features. A DNA test did confirm that they were unrelated. Synchronicities even manifest in encounters with other paranormal phenomena. In fact, they seem to be a staple among people who have had near-death experiences and UFO contact. People involved in these life-changing events often find themselves beset by wave after wave of coincidences. Now, sometime around the 1980s, English resident Suzanne Padfield began suffering from a series of vivid dreams where she found herself lost in the country. In the dream, her journey was interrupted by an enormous bright flying saucer that appeared above. The dreams would then end when she found herself on a recognizable stretch of road close to home. Now, after several months of these dreams, Suzanne found herself playing out the exact same scenario during her waking life. She had tried to take a shortcut but became lost, and just as in her dreams, she reached the top of a hill to read a signpost, only to be greeted by an enormous UFO. Now, eager to leave, she set a course for the nearest city lights she could see, and within moments, found herself on the same familiar stretch of road from her dreams. While Suzanne experienced other predictive dreams, she refused to believe that these were examples of precognition. Instead, she suspected that dreams and other thoughts might influence the likelihood of events unfolding, rather than predicting anything in the future. In other words, prophetic dreams are not a product of future events. Future events are the product of especially vivid dreams. Now, flying saucer eyewitnesses encounter synchronicities even in the absence of dreams, however. This is no more apparent than in the life of UFO experiencer Mike Cleland, whose book The Messengers, Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee conveys incredible coincidences stacking up both in his life and in the lives of alien abductees. As an example, consider the wild circumstances Mike details in his follow-up book, Stories from the Messengers, Owls, UFOs, and a Deeper Reality. On August 2, 2013, Mike received an email from a server named Allison, who worked at the Green Jade Diner in Boone, North Carolina. Now, she had found a copy of Mike's essay, the one which evolved into his first book, beside a coffee urn, and had contacted Mike thinking he had left it there. As it turns out, Allison had not only experienced UFOs in the past, but had strange experiences with owls as well, the exact area of research in which Mike specializes. But there's a problem. While Mike had indeed visited the Green Jade Diner, it had been on June 2nd, 2013. I mean, he did not even post the essay until July 3rd. Allison didn't find the essay until sometime in late July or early August. So, who printed the essay and left it at the Green Jade? And what are the odds that it would wind up in the hands of a UFO witness, to say nothing of a UFO witness who had also had weird owl stories? It's a mystery, one only deepened by the fact that Mike's mother passed away 2 days before receiving Allison's email. This highlights something that some people claim to have observed about synchronicities. They sometimes accompany profound life events, good or bad, as if dramatic change forces them to conjure up and bubble to the surface.
Hey, what's up? I'm Alex. I'm one of the video editors here with What Lurks Beneath. Currently doing something I probably shouldn't be doing. But anyways, I have a really interesting story about a synchronicity. So I'd like to share that with you guys. So this one actually takes place back when I was probably like 6 or 7 years old, still living in Georgia. I had this weird dream about this like strange hallway. I started walking down this hallway and I looked to my right and there's like these weird jars with like creatures in them. I remember there was like tile on the floor. It was like really bright. I remember looking to my left and I can see this door and then it opens and then I see some girl walk out and then I wake up. And then, you know, don't think about it. Years go by. I'm now 11 years old or so, living in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm walking through my middle school hallway. And then all of a sudden I realize I've been here before. And I look to my right and there's an entire bookshelf of like formaldehyde sealed like glass jars of like, you know, like animals and different little things, like those old sciencey kind of things. You know, tile, whatever. It's really bright, like fluorescent hallway. Look to my left and there's a door. And it's actually my 5th grade hallway, or 5th grade science room. And then right as the door opens, I see a girl walk out with the exact same face from my dream. And that was when it hit me. I was like, oh my gosh, I dreamed about moving to the city I'm living in years before it happened. So that's my synchronicity story.
How you doing, Lurklings? My name is Edward Payson. I'm a professional filmmaker that makes horror films and documentaries. I also edited the video you're watching right now. Now, it wasn't until I sat down and started editing this video for What Lurks Beneath that I had a name to go with the strange and unusual coincidences that I've been experiencing my entire life since I was a child. So I got to texting with Josh and he said that I should tell you guys about some of these strange coincidences and put them in this video. So the coincidences started when I was a really young boy. I was about 6 years old and my family decided to go on vacation to Disney World. My uncle, we were on a ride, I think it was Splash Mountain, and my uncle started asking me about school and how I liked school and how I liked the 1st grade. And I said it was great, except there was this girl in my class who always picked on me. A few moments later, that girl put her hand on my back and was at Disney World. And being from New Hampshire, Disney World is about 1,000 miles away, so it was like she appeared out of thin air. So my second strange coincidence happened when I was about 10 years old. I was in the mall with my brother and mother, and I was pushing my brother around. He was in a wheelchair, and we got lost. We basically got separated from my mom, and we were gone long enough to where she had the mall do an all call, and a nice gentleman ended up finding us and bringing us to JCPenney where my mother was waiting for us. And it gets weird there because 10 years later, the man who found us ended up becoming our stepfather, and my stepdad didn't even remember being the one to find us in the mall until 5 or 6 years after he was married to my mom. And we told him the story about how we got lost in the mall one day, and he was like, wait, you guys got lost in the mall? I found a boy and a boy in a wheelchair in the mall on such and such a date, and it ended up lining up, and he was the one who actually found us. The next coincidence happened in the early 2000s. Being from New England, people just assume that I'm a Patriots fan. Me and my brothers are not Patriots fans, and we were watching one of the games, and my brother just jokingly said, I hope Tom Brady breaks his leg on the next play. And then the next play, Tom Brady broke his leg. So that's just a silly one. Midway through high school, I changed schools. I ended up going to a school in Waltham, Massachusetts, and I ended up having to make a whole new round of friends. And when I was going to my first friend's house that I had made, I had no idea where he lived, and I had to MapQuest out where he lived. So of course, not being able to read MapQuest, I went to the wrong place. And it just so happens that the place I went to, I tried to turn around in the driveway and my car got stuck because it was snowing outside. My car was making all kinds of noise trying to get out of that driveway until the owner of the house came outside, and it just so happens, coincidentally, to be the boss of the place I was currently working at Hollywood Video. So my Hollywood Video boss helped me get out of the driveway by digging me out. The next coincidence happened on my wedding weekend. My wife and I got married in Las Vegas, and we ended up taking a plane from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. And on the way there, sat between us was one of my friends from Los Angeles. We didn't plan our tickets together, and it gets weirder from there because later that same night, we didn't make any plans with this person. My wife and I ended up going to a bar that was off the beaten path because we didn't want to pay the prices that you typically pay on the Las Vegas Strip. So we went to this, hole-in-the-wall bar, and lo and behold, the same person that was on the plane ended up being at the bar. At that point, my wife and I were like, is this guy following us? What is going on? And it gets weirder from there because we took a completely different airline home. because we use a site called Skiplag, and the way that that works is it kind of just finds you the cheapest flights, even if they're from different airlines. And, would you believe it, in between us again was this guy Ryan. So without being in some kind of weird simulation, I have no idea how this person could possibly be involved in our entire Vegas trip. The next one's a little tragic and hits home a little bit for me and my wife. My wife's best friend was visiting her family in Wisconsin on Christmas Eve in 2020, and she was texting back and forth with my wife, and the last text she got from our friend was how cold it was in Wisconsin and how my wife would hate it because it's so cold there. And tragically, later that night, she ended up crashing her car and ended up dying of hypothermia. Anyway, those are some ways that I've experienced synchronicity throughout my life. I'll hand it back to Josh.
Perhaps the wildest synchronicities of all time can be found across 3 historical tragedies: the sinking of the RMS Titanic and the assassinations of President Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. Now, in 1898, Morgan Robertson penned a book entitled The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility. The book features an enormous British ocean liner named the SS Titan, which collides with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Despite being deemed unsinkable, the boat succumbs to the waves, and since there weren't enough lifeboats available, nearly everyone perishes. Now, sadly, the book does not feature anyone shouting, "I'm the king of the world." You can clearly see how the book predicts the sinking of the Titanic with alarming accuracy, 14 years before the ship infamously sank on the morning of April 15th, 1912. Now, the Titan is described as 800 feet long, while the Titanic was 882 feet. Both were traveling at similar speeds, and while the fictional Titan was traveling from New York to England, the real Titanic traveled from England to New York. Now, for some presidents, at some point, people noticed how many eerie connections between the lives of Lincoln and Kennedy, 2 of our only 4 US presidents to ever be assassinated. While some of the connections were simply inaccurate, most were verifiably true, begging the question as to whether or not some invisible force binds these 2 historical tragedies across time and space. Both the last names Lincoln and Kennedy contained 7 letters. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846 and took the presidency in 1860. Kennedy, too, was elected in Congress in 1946 and took to presidency in 1960. Both admins were concerned about civil rights. Both men married in their 30s to women who were in their 20s. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were shot in the head on a Friday, and both their successors were Southerners with the last name of Johnson. Andrew Johnson, born in 1808, and Lyndon B. Johnson, born in 1908. But if you think I'm done yet, I'm not, because the similarities do not end there and even extend to the assassins themselves. But yes, I know, Oswald was a patsy, but just roll with me on this, alright? The names of both assassins John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald each contain 15 letters. Both were born south of the Mason-Dixon line. They were born 101 years apart. Not quite a perfect match, but pretty close. Booth fled from a theater after killing Lincoln, while Oswald fled to a theater. Both Booth and Oswald were themselves assassinated before they could stand trial. Now, bizarrely enough, Booth's brother, Edwin, saved Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, in late 1863 or early 1864. Robert had almost fallen on the train tracks when Edwin grabbed him by the collar. Robert would go on to become perhaps the only person to ever witness 3 presidential assassinations. His father, James A. Garfield, in 1881, and William McKinley in 1901. Now, the Lincoln-Kennedy connections doesn't prove anything, but so many coincidences stacking up certainly suggest that, at the very least, aspects of our existence may be cyclical. This, coupled with the much smaller synchronicities we experience each day, force us to realize how little we truly know about our reality. Are we embedded within a simulation with bits of code repeating either by happenstance or to make some sort of point? Is there a deeper mystery at play in our lives, a script we ourselves perform as unwitting actors in a play we will never know? Or is everything simply one big coincidence, our lives subject to the whims of mere chance? I can't tell you one way or the other. nor can anyone who has not experienced these coincidences themselves. Synchronicity's true power is in the eye of the beholder. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Are we really living in a Matrix-like simulation where everything is planned and there is a hand in the forces at work here? Or do we live in a world and universe where coincidences happen all the time, no matter how extreme or often they occur? In this last section, we're going to go back underground. No, not to Los Angeles. We're going to explore things that are far more terrifying. Things that are not bound to one location. This episode is about bizarre and terrifying things experienced underground. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains are the southernmost extension of the Rockies. Although not as famous as their cousins to the north, the sub-range still features several impressive summits, some reaching 14,000 feet. Now in 1970, T. Adams joined a group of campers as they spent the night on one of these slopes in Colorado. He had no idea how much the experience would trouble him for years afterward. When he wrote about the event, he said this: camping on the western slope of the Sangre de Cristos, northwest of Mount Blanca and south of the sand dunes, we heard the sounds in 1970. 2 or 3 nights in succession, it cranked up. After midnight and subsided shortly before dawn, it wasn't really loud enough to hear over conversation, but definitely sounded like a motor of some sort, with a suggestion of a dynamo-type whine to it. Others had said that it sometimes seems louder than an ear to the ground. One could easily imagine the sound was coming from beneath the surface, but whether it did or not remains purely speculative. Although he didn't realize it at the time, Adams had unwittingly stepped into an age-old mythology, one describing uncanny noises rising from the unseen depths of our own planet. These are the stories of the mystery sounds from underground. Exactly what makes these noises and whether or not we should be alarmed remains unclear. But one thing is for certain, they have been happening for a very long time, and persist to this day. For nearly a century now, our popular culture has drawn our attention skyward. The fictions of our current era focus primarily on threats from above. If not from ourselves, then from extraterrestrials encroaching on our airspace. We believe that our best chance of contacting a non-human intelligence will come from the stars, a goal we might achieve by listening for their transmission or awaiting their craft as they scour the universe in their own search for intergalactic companionship. Few of us really do question what lurks beneath, yet some of our oldest mythologies place entire civilizations below our very feet, somewhere in the depths of the earth where they toil daily towards their unimaginable goals. Over the years, all manner of monsters came to infest this subterranean second earth. Everything from dragons and dwarves to giants, ogres, trolls, fairies, reptilians, even demons and the human dead. For the longest time, this destination had a distinctly spiritual flavor, the realm from which our souls either originated or most often returned to after death. Today's Christian hell found its origins in other subterranean destinations, like the Jewish Sheol and the Greek underworld. Mythic underworlds also figure in Tibetan Buddhist belief, Hindu mythology, and the ancient cosmologies of Celtic countries, Russia, Western Europe, and the New World. For example, some of the earliest indigenous traditions from North America indicate that certain tribes came to Earth through fissures in the ground. When the world was new, the Mandan people claim to have first surfaced from a cave near the Missouri River. The Iroquois speak of a similar origin, and some Hopi elders adamantly insist that their ancestors emerged into this, the fourth world, by ascending underground chambers. These fanciful locations often blend real-world geographical landmarks in their respective mythologies. Counterintuitively, sometimes these spots could be found above ground rather than strictly beneath. In most cases, there was still a subterranean aspect to these sites that kindled the ancient imagination. The Greeks even pinpointed specific caverns by which the underworld could be accessed. Through these portals came and went innumerable spirits, deities, and even individuals of great renown. Seeking enlightenment, a future seer or prophet might descend into the underworld on a journey known commonly as kutabasis, from which they would emerge knowing the secrets of the universe. Various indigenous cultures describe similar experiences where shamanic initiates receive their instruction in the mystical arts after entering underground spaces, or being kidnapped under the earth by supernatural forces. The ideas gained a degree of scientific legitimacy after their proposal by none other than Edmund Halley. In 1692, the English astronomer who lent his name to Halley's Comet was trying to reconcile some anomalous magnetic readings when he formulated a controversial hypothesis. Halley proposed the radical notion that the Earth's interior was hollow, spawning centuries of debate. In his model, after 500 miles of rocky crust, the innermost chambers of our planet gave way to a vast hollow chamber filled with 2 additional concentric shells and a central core. Each shell had its own dedicated atmosphere, separating it from the others, as well as its own magnetic pole and rotational speed. Halley left the room for the possibility that these shells sustained their own ecosystems, either unique biomes or mirror images of life on the surface. Now, over the intervening decades, Halley's ideas blended with those of other thinkers. Some rejected the notion that additional shells were nested inside, instead proposing that a small sun sat at the center of the Earth. Others suggested that the hollow Earth could be accessed via gigantic holes at the North or South Pole. All agreed in their suspicions, however. Something was going on beneath our feet, one of the last few frontiers left for humankind. This idea reached its fictional zenith with Jules Verne's 1864 classic Journey to the Center of the Earth. More recently, speculation surrounding the hollow Earth has flourished on the internet and risen to prominence once again in the legendary Pictures monsterverse, which reimagines cinematic titans like King Kong and Godzilla as the oldest original inhabitants of our planet, all hailing from a realm beneath our feet. As with so many other aspects of conspiracy culture, the Hollow Earth theory also exhibits a gruesome association with the 20th century's worst ideologies. Adolf Hitler's fascination with the occult is well documented, and the Hollow Earth seems to have been no exception. Several highly placed members of the Third Reich adhered to the idea that the inner Earth could be accessed and exploited. Some of the wilder speculations hold that the Germans retreated within our planet, where they continued their tyrannical rule and, wildest of all, started building the UFOs we see in the sky today. This horrendous legacy, notwithstanding, the Hollow Earth idea only predated World War II, but endures long afterward. Any association with history's monsters should not diminish the fact that human beings have always suspected the presence of something other living beneath the earth. Our oldest beliefs suggest that we are but one of many tenants in the building, as it were, sharing our planet with something just beneath the surface. Older ideas like hell and fairyland seem quaint to modern sensibilities, but that doesn't mean the Hollow Earth idea is dead. They have given way to more sinister notions. Rumors of covert military bases conducting illicit experiments underground, or extraterrestrial outposts waiting for an opportunity to strike from their subterranean hiding places. Those advocating this possibility point to eyewitness, or should I say, ear witness testimony. For centuries, people have reported ominous noises which defy identification. When they are finally pinpointed, witnesses often describe these sounds as welling up from underground in the form of voices, or most commonly, the sound of subterranean machinery. While plenty of accounts happen once and are never heard again, descriptions of sounds from underground tend to persist in a given area over a long period of time. This detail may offer a clue. Do these sounds represent a stationary civilization beneath the earth, or even some nefarious long-term project being enacted without our knowledge? One of the more interesting cases involves the moo dust noises. a series of terrifying booms heard by Puritans who settled in south central Connecticut. They were first documented by colonists in 1702. Now, over the years, these noises have been compared to firearms or thunder. Their origin point remains unclear, but many claim that these sounds seem to arise from the very earth itself. The Moodus noise, which continues this day, actually predate European colonization. Unbeknownst to the Puritans, the Wangunk Indians had heard the sounds for generations prior to their arrival. They had long ago named the area mount Tom Macamudus, meaning place of bad noises. From this term, the settlers derived the name Mudus, a village found today in East Haddam. The Wangunk believed that these sounds came from their god Hobomoko, a wrathful deity who presided from a sapphire throne beneath Mount Tom. His voice would issue commandments either as booms or whispers, leaving the medicine men in a constant scramble to appease him through prayers and sacrifices. The settlers noticed that sometimes the Moodus noises would continue nonstop until abruptly ceasing for years at a time. Then, yet for no apparent reason, activity would begin again. To explain why their frequency increased after colonization, the native population said that their god had been angered by the arrival of white men. The Puritans, on the other hand, believed it was the voice of their own god, full of righteous fury. God Almighty is to be seen and trembled at, and what has been often heard among us, wrote Reverend Stephen Hosmer of Eastern Haddam, Connecticut in 1729. Continuing, he claimed to have myself heard 8 or 10 sounds successively and imitating small arms in the space of 5 minutes. I have, I suppose, heard several hundreds of them within 20 years, some more, some less terrible. Sometimes we have heard them almost every day, and great numbers of them in the space of a year. Oftentimes I have observed them coming down from the north, imitating slow thunder, which shakes the house and all that is in them. Now, according to apocryphal legend, the sounds became so infamous that King George himself dispatched an alchemist by the name of Dr. Steele to put an end to these noises. The story goes that Dr. Steele pinpointed a fossil he called the carbuncle that was supposedly the source of the noises. He set up shop in a blacksmith's quarters where he focused his arcane talents on removing the carbuncle from the earth. The residents reported smoke and flames issuing from the shop on a nightly basis until Dr. Steele succeeded. Unfortunately, he claimed that a second, smaller carbuncle would continue disrupting the peace around Mount Tom, or seen another way, he was full of it. The Moodus noises were still heard sporadically to this day. They most famously live on in the work of acclaimed horror author H.P. Lovecraft, who used them as inspiration for his 1928 short story, The Dunwich Horror. The Moodus noises are confined to a relatively small region in Connecticut. Although the noises themselves are certainly strange, the area does not appear to attract any more supernatural activity than might be found elsewhere. The same cannot be said for other locations, however. It is quite common to find reports of underground sounds in what paranormal aficionados dub window areas. These spots, which can be found all over the planet, seem to display an affinity for unexplained phenomena. Reports in these areas encompass all manner of mysteries: ghost lights, poltergeist activity, UFOs, cryptids, alien big cats, you name it. The late Fortean author John Keel is credited with originating the window area concept. Though the idea appears informally much earlier, over the course of his research, Keel noticed that UFO sightings tended to cluster around significant archaeological sites. Now, these clusters roughly extended in a 200-mile diameter around such locations, and seemed to infuse the surrounding region with high strangeness. Keel claimed that each U.S. state supported 2 to 10 windows, including the infamous window area of Mason County, West Virginia, epicenter of the 1966 to 67 Mothman sightings, and once home to countless Indian mounds, many of which have been tragically destroyed. Keel's window area hypothesis has its strengths and its weaknesses, and is not without its own problematic aspects. Regardless, Even a superficial review of paranormal literature suggests that the idea has some merit. Anomalies do seem to cluster in certain areas, even if they are not always tied to archaeological sites. Perhaps the most famous window area of the modern era is Sherman Ranch, also known more commonly as Skinwalker Ranch. This property, which sits squarely in the historically haunted Uinta Basin, has been the focus of innumerable supernatural claims since it came to international attention in the mid-1990s. Witnesses report cattle mutilations, unexplained aerial phenomena, cryptids, and, predictably, noises emanating from beneath the earth. After their purchase of the property in 1994, the Sherman family often noted the unmistakable sounds of heavy machinery or metal equipment coming from under the earth. One of the more famous examples involves a heavy post hole digger hauled inexplicably into the top branches of a tree. Another time, a friend of the family was helping dig a ditch at the ranch when he was repeatedly approached by the shadow of a man. The shadow would wander into his field of vision, and as he worked, only to stop and watch in silence. Each time the laborer looked up from the ground and he invariably found an empty field, no one could be seen. Recent television programs have reinforced the possibility that something does lurk underneath the Sherman Ranch. Perhaps a top-secret subterranean military facility or even an extraterrestrial base. Strange electrical currents reputedly course through the very soil there. Even as far back as the 1990s, a psychic brought to the ranch sensed that a technology that was located underground was generating anomalies on the property. A military base would only serve as a partial explanation for the high strangeness at the ranch. However, indigenous American tribes thought that the Uinta Basin always alluded to some type of intelligence dwelling beneath the ground in this isolated corner of the Southwest, long before settlers ever arrived. Skinwalker Ranch may get all the glory, but another property in Washington state sees as much or more paranormal activity: the Yakima Indian Reservation, home to the Confederated Tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation, sits on the eastern side of the Cascade Mountains. It has always been a hotbed for the activity identical to that found at Skinwalker Ranch, including strange noises whose source cannot always be determined and more often than not seem to originate underground. A report made by fire control officers exemplifies the claims from this area. In September of 1978, the sound of underground turbines or engines was heard at Sopelia Tower at the southern boundary of the Yakima Nation for 7 hours, approximately 9 p.m. to 4 a.m., September 3rd to the 4th. The noise was like a turbine or unsynchronized propellers on a multi-engine aircraft. When led outside the lookout station, the fire's lookout dog displayed anxiety, and the lookout felt barely perceptible vibrations under her feet when standing on a concrete slab. The lookout said she had heard the same sound during the summer of 1978, but always during the daylight. These sounds were reported regularly by reservation employees, like Fire Control Officer Bill Vogel. Vogel often noticed these turbine-like noises while on patrol in the reservation's remote back canyons, often accompanied by a vibrating sensation beneath his feet. UFO researcher Ken Hunt reported similar sensations on the property heard along the banks of the bordering Columbia River. He compared the noise to the racket generated by a subterranean mining operation. Equally perplexing are inexplicable noises heard above ground, which still seem to suggest that something is digging on the reservation. In 1979, a resident and repeat UFO witness regularly heard what he described as the sound of a steel post driver hammering repeatedly into the ground. The noise seemed to originate near an irrigation ditch behind his home. The activity would continue for about 20 minutes at the time before pausing, then resuming later. The witness said that each time he tried to pinpoint the source of the sounds, they would always stop, as if something knew he was drawing close. Although he was curious, his dogs wanted nothing to do with the noises, as they always seemed frightened whenever they began. Like the Moodus noise, the sound would cease for long stretches, in this case up to a month before resuming once again, even in midwinter when the ground was frozen. On these occasions, the snow around the irrigation ditch remained untouched, ruling out the possibility that a trespasser had traipsed into his backyard to dig. Residents reported other noises rising up from the earth on the reservation. Whirs, clicks, buzzes, the sound of an idling caterpillar or heavy earth mover, and even the revving of an invisible V8 engine. In addition to this incessant racket, residents on the Yakima Indian Reservation are plagued by a host of other phenomena. UFOs dart through the skies in all shapes and sizes, ranging from Zeppelin-like craft to gigantic fiery orange-red orbs which fire spike-like rays of white light. Poltergeist activity and shadow people lurk in the corners of homes. Above all, residents on the reservations report regular interactions with Bigfoot. A surprising link can be drawn between Sasquatch sightings and underground sounds. After all, many cryptozoologists speculate that the creatures dwell in the subterranean environments like caverns or caves. Plenty of sightings occur in the vicinity of abandoned mine shafts as well. Most reports describe Bigfoot vocalizations and wood knocks made on the surface. When emanating from below, however, the noises heard in these areas rarely sound like primitive primates living underground. More often than not, they have a frighteningly mechanical quality, calling into question whether or not some sort of technology generates sightings of these large, hairy hominids. Over the course of his research, Bigfoot investigator Peter Gattila noted that sightings often included strange noises he could not account for. These sounds often go unreported by other cryptozoologists who either innocently omit them or deliberately suppress them. At best, they don't think the noises are related, while at worst, they know that such anomalies don't support the idea of a flesh and blood creature. Gattila wrote this: "I've experienced some of these phenomena myself. Strange sounds, usually at night and usually mechanical, some from everywhere and from underground. These sounds, which often occur in combinations, are described as variously as buzzing, beeping, whirling, whirring, humming, as heavy like diesel locomotive on a steep grade, wheels turning like an idling car motor, like muffled helicopter rotors, explosions, rumbles, popping, and distorted or garbled voices from below ground or in the distance." Gattila further listed other peculiarities seen during his search for Bigfoot, like strange lights, UFOs, and unusual physical, emotional, or psychic states. He is not the first to have made this connection. In their 1976 book, Bigfoot researchers Ann Slate and Alan Barry describe similar noises. The book outlines numerous expeditions into California's national forests, which saw a spate of Sasquatch activity during the 70s. Participants in these outings soon began to suspect that Bigfoot displayed some sort of underground connection. Some even took their speculation a step further, asserting that the creatures were perhaps aided by someone with sophisticated technology. In one chilling example, the researchers left their tape recorders running overnight, hoping to capture Sasquatch vocalizations in the forest. When they played the tapes back, they were shocked. There were no animalistic grunts, snorts, or howls. Instead, they heard sounds of machinery, those of a generator or hydroelectric plant in operation, coming from beneath the earth. Slate and Barry explain that these noises do not remain consistent over the course of the recordings, and instead subtly change as if new gears are set in motion. On another recording, the sounds abruptly end and a robotic voice appears shouting, "Keep out, we don't want." The voice then fades away. More and more witnesses have stepped forward in recent years to share their accounts of subterranean sounds, not because solo experiences have increased, but because the phenomenon has encroached into urban centers. These incidents leave entire communities scratching their heads as to what exactly is going on. In 2015, in Puebla, Mexico, long, booming sounds echoed through residential neighborhoods in the city of Atcancingo. They clearly emanated from underground. Officials were unable to identify the sounds, but nonetheless reassured residents that they were safe. This did not prevent a minor panic from ensuing, however. More recently, at 5 a.m. on February 10th, 2020, a loud groan issued from below the city streets of Anchorage, Alaska. The noise continued in several bursts, rising in a crescendo before abruptly stopping. The sound was reported throughout the city and well into the countryside, with some hearing it only once and others claiming that it continued for hours on end. Many were awoken from their sleep. One resident described it as almost like a foghorn and screeching metal on metal. Another said it resembled a submarine scraping the bottom of a pool or something. Yet another, who claimed to have heard it other times throughout the years, compared it to underwater moaning. Some of the most recent accounts of underground sounds surfaced, no pun intended, in late 2021. In September of last year, mysterious subterranean sounds began emanating from a house in Kerala, in India. A slight vibration attended the noises. Authorities had investigated, but in the absence of seismic activity, failed to determine a cause. Another home nearby also experienced strange thumps during this time frame, seemingly at random yet strong enough to spill water from pots. In both cases, these sounds were localized, isolated to each dwelling, and were not reported by any neighbors in their homes. This was not the case in Greece. 3 months later, an entire neighborhood, located within Thessalonica, was plunged into hysteria as rhythmic, subterranean thumps began pounding the streets every night. The noises would begin around midnight, persisting into the early morning hours. There's videos recorded at the time that clearly show their volume increasing as the camera nears the ground, leaving little doubt as to where the sounds were coming from. What they were, on the other hand, is a bit of a mystery. Now, eventually, authorities settled upon a mundane explanation, though plenty were left unsatisfied. Vasilis Milfas, a geologist at Aristotle University, said, "The sound comes from a specific street under which there are water and natural gas pipes. I would conjecture that it's from the drop in water pressure at night. I would rule out underground shifts because such phenomena don't follow a pattern. It is important to remember that many of these frightening sounds do have a mundane origin. Subterranean water sources, buried urban infrastructure, deep ocean currents, and sound refracting above ground can all make it seem as though a legion of dwarves are delving beneath our feet. Sometimes ice on frozen lakes can crack, causing the uncanny sound of large cables clanging together underground. Other times, seismic activity is clearly to blame. Our cities and towns sit precariously atop a network of tectonic plates, and this is, at least sometimes, why we hear ominous rumblings under the earth. The Moodus noise, for example, may have been the result of tectonic stress in some cases. The sounds famously ceased for a time after a massive earthquake in 1727. In the 1980s, and in March of 2011, a subsequent earthquake in Connecticut caused the Moodus noises to return, strongly implying a connection between the two. But, like everything else in the world, these subterranean sounds don't have a single explanation or answer. None of these can account for engines running underground or gigantic gears slipping into place beneath our feet. Other mysterious noises may be related to these underground sounds. Loud booming, skyquakes have been reported for decades, supported today by videos appearing online. While these seem to come from above, they may actually be welling up from underneath or represent the same phenomenon displaced to the skies. Inexplicable mystery hums may also be related, of which there are numerous examples. Now, in these accounts, the residents of a town slowly find themselves driven to the point of madness by noises that drone on incessantly day and night as they conduct their lives. Many victims report they are unable to sleep in the face of such torture. Such was the case in Hythe, Southampton. In 2013, dozens of residents began seeking medical attention, suspecting they had come down with tinnitus. In reality, the entire town had noticed that their evenings were filled with a low-frequency hum. "I thought I was going mad at first," said one resident. "I hear it every night unless it's windy or raining." Another victim explained that her family regularly experienced a humming noise at night. "A few times we put it down to a neighbor's washing machine or dishwasher, but it's happening so frequently that we know it's not the case. It's a really low-pitched sound that literally pulsates through the house." The official explanation left much to be desired. You see, Authorities claim that the sound was caused by a male midshipman fish who let loose with a low, droning hum during mating season. Come on. The call simultaneously attracts females and challenges potential rivals. The long wavelength of the vocalizations, scientists argue, allow the noise to permeate the entire community. Notably, this was the only possible explanation offered, meaning that if the fish weren't to blame, the government had no rationalization for the hum. Oh no, they had no idea what was going on. The weak explanation offered for the hum speaks to how little scientists can definitively declare regarding mystery sounds. Similar anomalies have troubled oceanographers for decades now. Numerous loud, booming noises recorded in the world's oceans remain unaccounted for. Recordings obtained from one of the world's deepest holes left geologists baffled as well. A hole on the border of Germany and the Czech Republic stretches well over 5 miles deep, and in 2013 became the site of a project carried out by a Dutch artist of the name Laura Kiva. Her wish was to record sounds from the lowest point she could access for an art installation. At first, the request was met with disinterest. She was told that all her recordings would come back empty, if they could even withstand the trip. The bottom of the hole sees temperatures in excess of 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Undeterred, she obtained a geophone. The device could not only withstand the temperature, but included an ultrasonic sensor to pick up sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. She lowered the equipment and retrieved the recordings, processing them through software to bring them within audible range. To her delight and surprise, the recordings were filled with unsettling sounds, resembling everything from rolling thunderclouds to onrushing tornadoes. All the hair on my arm stood up straight, and if I hear it now again, after many times, it still has the same effect on me, she said. Her art project was a resounding success. Scientists cannot explain what she recorded. The sounds aren't obviously recognizable as seismic, leaving them to theorize that perhaps it's simply electronic feedback from the geophone itself. In short, mysteries still exist, both in the skies above and in the ground below. Subterranean anomalies long ago caught the attention of the UFO community, who speculate the entire alien race might thrive somewhere beneath our feet. To their credit, a large number of sightings describe aerial anomalies entering caves, oceans, and what appear to be bases embedded within mountainsides. What's more is there's no shortage of alien abduction featuring underground settings, ranging from dank, gloomy caverns to sophisticated clinical facilities. While this could serve as its own topic, there are also numerous eyewitnesses who claim that seismic disturbances erupt in the wake of UFO sightings. In some cases, these might actually be earthlights, a natural, if rare, luminescent phenomenon generated by piezoelectrical stress before, during, or after earthquakes. Since earthlights are so rare and difficult to reproduce, we are left wondering if something more miraculous is going on. Such may have been the case in a May 30th, 1987 sighting in Puerto Rico. Residents reported an enormous red fireball that buzzed above a lagoon. The next day, the southwestern portion of the island territory was racked by a powerful tremor, and sounds of explosions filled the air. Explosions which seemed to originate from within the earth. To make matters more complex, terrestrial government facilities exist underground. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's a fact. Some estimate that worldwide over 10,000 such facilities have been built. Their presence raises innumerable questions surrounding why they are down there and, more importantly, what are they doing? The past 5 years have shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that the world's government, the United States in particular, are heavily interested in the UFO mystery. Not that there really was much of a doubt to begin with. As the topic of extraterrestrial life becomes more and more popular, we are constantly called upon to turn our eyes to the skies. But hey, folks, don't be fooled. This might be the oldest trick in the book, the first lesson taught by magicians. As the left hand busies itself, pay attention to what the right hand is doing, also known commonly as sleight of hand, because as you watch the skies, keep an ear to the ground. You might hear something unsettling.
You know, it's funny, as I rewatch all these old episodes with you,
It's painful for me to see how bad aspects of my production were at that time and how many things I've refined and changed over the years. Everything from proper audio, lighting, editing, scripting, delivery. But hey, if you can't look back at your old content and cringe, then you're not improving. More importantly, if you guys are enjoying this series where we go back in time and revisit some very interesting episodes I've since forgotten about, go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more exciting storytelling coming your way. Moreover, since you guys made it this far, I want you to comment down below bearded mystery so that I know who made it to the end and who didn't. Never forget, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.